And you are live.
Good afternoon. I am so excited to welcome you all to today's Early Feasibility Study Forum. That is the first opportunity for the Medical Device Innovation Consortium to partner with the Dartmouth Device Symposium. So it's a wonderful collaboration. The two groups have been working together now for years on this particular issue, but the fact that we get to co-sponsor an event today is really exciting. And so I'm happy to have you join us today. I'm going to have us jump to the slides, please. And so I'm Pamela Goldberg, President and CEO of MDIC, the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. And next slide, please. And we are a public-private partnership focused on getting patients better products faster, safer, cheaper, but we do that as a collaborative effort among the government agencies and industry participants and patient advocacy groups. And we work together on an array of fronts. Early feasibility studies came to us a few years ago as a priority issue for the FDA and for industry. And so it was the perfect opportunity for MDIC to tackle these issues as part of our clinical science initiative. We have been working on this for quite a while and have created a number of tools to address this. And today is a great opportunity for us to bring that to you. We have had over 250 registrants for today and really excited to tackle some of the meat of the issues around this with all of you. Next slide. So one of the ways that MDIC is successful in bringing the community together is to bring together the clinicians and the patients and all the other parties to the table to be a part of the discussion. So as I mentioned, we've really moved down the road quite a bit in terms of creating tools and opportunities. Those can be found on the MDIC website. And hope you'll take advantage of the learnings from the amazing array of speakers that we have on the schedule today. And certainly one of the biggest champions of this issue, in addition to Aaron Kaplan, who is co-sponsoring today, and David Holmes, who is an additional sponsor of today, two MDIC board members that I'd like to call out, Chip Hance and Rick Jeffrion, have really helped MDIC get to where we are in terms of creating tools and opportunities to make an event like today happen. So with that, another key proponent of this has been Dr. Jeff Sherin from CDRH. And Jeff has been saying for a long time, why is it that there were so few early feasibility studies done in the United States? Why were so many of them done overseas? And his encouragement and his efforts have really helped us move this initiative forward and bring more and more early feasibility studies to the United States. And so really grateful to have the opportunity to introduce Jeff today. He has done so much for FDA to bring it to this collaborative place where it is today. So thank you very much. And I'd like to hand this off now to Jeff Sherin. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pamela. Thank you to you, your team at MDIC, and Aaron Kaplan and his team for holding this symposium. And thanks to all the participants, too. This is a very important topic to CDRH. And I thought I'd take a few minutes to give you our perspective and a little bit of my own perspective about what I think makes early feasibility studies, or EFS, different. And I'm going to give you three. So first off, it's what's at stake. I mean, we know that innovators, where they conduct their EFS, is where they're going to bring their technology early. And so those studies are conducted in other countries. That's where the technology is going to go. And in fact, a decade ago, that's what we were seeing. If you look back at 2004 on clinicaltrials.gov, maybe not the perfect measure, but 87% of the studies being conducted were in the US. And then in 2009, that number drops to 45%. And so we were seeing those studies and technologies overseas. We knew that's a problem, not only because our patients don't get the technology, but also our healthcare professionals don't have the opportunity to learn that technology early on. And so one of the things that we looked at is making changes in the program. And that brings me up to sort of the second issue that we deal with and what's different about EFS. It's the fact that the obstacles for conducting an EFS are somewhat higher than it is for other types of clinical trials. And that's in part because people are risk averse. And when you're dealing with a device for which you don't know all that much about it, particularly something that's implanted, people get scared. And so all the inefficiencies that exist for conducting clinical trials in the US, well, they get magnified. And on top of it, the amount of funding that investigator, their institution is going to get is also far less because it's so much fewer patients. And so when we look back on this combination of things, a decade ago, we decided we needed to make some important changes at the FDA, and we launched an EFS program. We made changes in how we run things. We had people who took a lead on it. And even today, Andy Farb, Graham Zuckerman, Nicole Ibrahim continue to do just a phenomenal work on trying to advance this program. But we also made some important policy changes, and those are described in a final guidance we put out in 2013. And one of the things that we conveyed is that you don't need all of the non-clinical testing to be done. Certainly some of the testing is of not great value and it adds a lot of cost when the device design is not finalized, as in the case with an EFS. And so the policy we put forward is just-in-time testing. Do the right test at the right time. And the combination of things that we did in the program helped increase the number of EFS studies that were being conducted in the US. In the past 7 years, we've seen more than a doubling of the number of EFS investigational device exemptions that have come through. And so now, during that time period, over 200 such studies have been approved. And that's been involving over 2,500 subjects. And in fact, in fiscal year 2020, we approved 80% of the EFS IDs sent to us on the first cycle. That's great. And now we're seeing EFS studies being conducted across the product lines that we regulate. Most of them are in cardiovascular and then neurological devices, and probably the lowest amount is in orthopedics, but it's really picked up. And then the third place where I think EFS is different is on the solution. It really takes a community to solve this. And we're big fans of working with the community and having the community come up with solutions. One of the reasons why the idea of a collaborative community is a strategic priority for CDRH. And in this case, there are issues that go well beyond just regulatory, and why we were so excited that key members in the cardiovascular clinical community and in industry came together, and now under the auspices of MDIC, launching in 2019, sort of an EFS cardiovascular site consortium, where we got a network of clinical trial sites who have committed to provide efficiencies in IRB approval, in contracting, and in first subject enrollment. And this is terrific combined with the regulatory side. And now already we're starting to see some improvements as a result of it, and then looking forward to expanding it beyond cardiovascular into neurological. So what does this really mean for the future? And I want to leave you with the following. Where do we go from here? Well, from our perspective, it's we continue to need to act as a community. Regulatory issues, non-regulatory issues, and of course, including the payment side, because we really need to have these studies supported. And we also need to be strategic. So we should be thinking about proactively expanding all of these EFS efforts into disease and device areas that we know are traditionally being conducted in other countries, and try to pull them back. Engaging directly with the innovators for those technologies and seeing if we can draw them back to the US. Enlist the active participation of the clinical research leaders. We need them as champions in this. And then on the trials performance itself, we should facilitate a lot more of the learn as you go mentality. That we've got a technology, we're learning about the EFS. So you know what? Let's have other changes made and continue to work it through on an EFS study. And we try to provide some opportunities to facilitate that in that 2013 guidance. But then let's move it to the next stage. How we go from that EFS into a much more streamlined sort of natural roll into a pivotal clinical trial. So we get away from the stage gate approach on clinical studies, and we have much more of a fluid, continuous, efficient clinical evaluation of a technology moving forward. And then really finally, we continue to need to engage and collaborate. Collaboration is going to be the hallmark of success in this space. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to Aaron.
Thank you, Jeff. And I too would like to welcome you all to this symposium. I'm Aaron Kaplan, a professor of medicine at Dartmouth. Early feasibility testing has been a real focus of mine because of my role as a device innovator entrepreneur. And I think I can frame this by my own experience. Can you advance the next slide, please? And the next slide. Which takes us back to 2007, when I was involved with Triton Medical. This was a company I founded with Richard Davis, a very gifted engineer. Next click, please. And this company
If you can hear me
was...
okay, your audio's coming in kind of not ideal. I'm going to refresh some sources. Just give me 1 second. Let me just try something real quick.
Okay, I can go to earbuds.
I don't think that's the issue. If you can actually just refresh your browser, I think that might solve the issue. So just quickly refresh real quick.
Refresh my browser.
Yep, just entirely. Check.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Loud and clear. You're good to move forward. Thank you.
Great. So let me take you back to 2007. Hopefully you can hear me. I was involved with Triton Medical, which was founded by myself along with Richard Davis, a very gifted engineer. We were backed by U.S. venture capitalists and did all of our early testing and preclinical testing, animal testing in the U.S. After some very brief dialogue with FDA, they really encouraged us to go to Europe to get our early experience, which we did, and spent about a month at 3 leading sites, doing our first clinical case in Siegburg with Professor Grube, followed by experience in Paris and Rotterdam. After a month on the road, we really were able to assemble a pretty large experience, which really allowed us to get, in the next few months, a CE mark, at which time we had enough data to then come back to FDA and start our dialogue with them about the IDE study. This is in stark contrast, next click, with Conformal Medical, next click, which underwent its first clinical testing back in 2019 and is still involved in early feasibility evaluation of this next generation left atrial appendage occlusion device. Like Triton, next click, Conformal was founded by myself with a different group of engineers. We were funded primarily by a U.S. capital and did all of our early design, development, animal work in the U.S. This was done with very early dialogue that started very early with FDA, who was really part and parcel of the team as we developed our protocol for the EFS, and really was able to work with them. And I think it's setting up a dialogue that's very well informed, that is currently ongoing, which is focused on the pivotal trial. The other real benefit was the ability to have our engineers embedded, or our clinicians nearly embedded with our engineers. One of our sites is within 20 miles of the office. Jamie Kim at Catholic Medical Center in Manchester, just south of me, is over at the company working with the engineers. Our engineers are down in New York and Philadelphia at sites there. That familiarity and that interaction is hard to underestimate. So there's many benefits, and we've seen this dialogue move forward very important from a sponsor perspective in development, but it's also very important as we plan for the clinical studies. Next slide. This has been done, and these advances in the U.S. Is in large part due to efforts with groups like this under the leadership of FDA. So pleased that Jeff Sherin could help kick us off. And but also in certain ways has been next click due to the current environment in Europe. I want to emphasize this is not a zero-sum game. The current decrease in work in Europe, next click, is due in large part to the current transition to an MDR, which we'll talk more about during the symposium. The uncertainty about where, how, and what you need for CE mark has really dampened the early feasibility activity in Europe, and we look forward to getting through this transition so the community can really tap into the great centers and talent that's over there. Next slide. Which brings us to today's symposium, which I think has been set up well by Pamela's and Dr. Sherin's comments. I want to acknowledge David Holmes, my co-chair, and who's also the chair of the executive committee, whose members are listed here. So we have a 3.5-hour symposium, next slide, which will have 3 roundtable conversations intermixed with 4 interviews that have been pre-recorded that I performed. The first with Jamie Wikowiak, who was a COO until very recently of the Research Institute associated with Baylor Scott and White. Jamie is a powerhouse and has run a clinical center and has been a big proponent of EFS chairing symposium similar to this, and her perspective I think will be very helpful. Two other perspectives are very interesting. They're from clinician investigators who got started by running very successful clinical sites, which had very strong EFS components. Ian Meredith from Australia, who's now a global chief medical officer at Boston Scientific, and Jeff Pamela, who was recently at the BI Deaconess and now is at Medtronic. The perspective of an investigator who now is at a sponsor, I think, is very interesting, and I think their interviews are very instructive. We'll have our last interview with Andy Farb, who, along with Jeff Sherin, Bram Zuckerman, Nicole Ibrahim, have been really at the vanguard of FDA efforts. I don't think we appreciate some of the comments made by Dr. Sherin, or appreciate how much really support that is required to the reviewing groups in an EFS JIT dynamic. There's been a lot of work there, of which we are seeing the fruits. But just as one success leads to the next challenge, that is clearly the case here and will be the focus of the symposium. Next slide. The first roundtable will be moderated by Chip Hance, who has deep industry experience. And we'll get an update from John Hunt from MDIC about recent activities, and then have a roundtable conversation. Very pleased, in particular, to have Steve Farmer join us from CMS. A lot of the current issues have to do with negotiating contracts and really understanding the reimbursement dynamic. So very pleased. I think we'll have a very good session there. This will be followed, next slide, with a roundtable conversation that will be moderated by Andy Farb from FDA, which will really hone down looking at the successes with EFS programs in the structural heart space, and to understand what learnings we can extract from that as we look to broaden the footprint of this program to other areas like neurointervention. Adnan Siddiqui, a leading neurosurgeon, to EP. Vivek Reddy, one of the premier EP physicians, will help us with this, as well as Paul Saraja, who is a structuralist who really understands the space. We'll also have perspectives from startups, Catherine Kumar and Lauren Baker, who's a consultant who has deep experience here. Next slide. This will be followed by our last roundtable conversation that's focused on what's going on in Europe. Rick Jeffrion, who ran a structural heart company until recently, will chair that, and we'll have input both from entrepreneurs such as Olivier Delporte, as well as venture capitalists who invest on both sides of the pond. Particularly pleased to have Nitin Mehta here from Tov Sud to help us have an understanding of how the notified bodies are seeing this space and how they're navigating the MDR transition. Next slide. This will be followed by closing comments from David Holmes, who I see as the Dean of EFS and has a very keen ear and can help us put this all together. Next slide. I want to acknowledge all the hard work that's gone into this meeting. Joni Moritz-Smith in my office, along with Judy Gonzalez, a consultant, working very hard with our colleagues over at MDIC, led by John Hunt, with Liliana Rincon-Gonzalez, Taylor Jackson, and Joseph Davison, really helping out here. We are very interested in your feedback. Tomorrow, you'll be getting an email. We want your feedback. It really allows us to be more effective in planning a future symposia. Next slide. Before I finish, a couple of comments about the platform. You can move around the panels to increase the size to whatever suits you the best. Also, you can scroll down below the speaker bios. You see Lauren Baker's there. There's a bar you can scroll down. You can make that bigger. If you get yourself in a place you don't like, just hit the circular button, and that'll get you back to the default. If you have any questions, please write this number down, 773-645-4877. I'll repeat that, 773-645-4877 for technical help. There are people there who can help you through problems if you're having that. And with that, I really want to move forward to the interview with Jamie Wikowiak. Thanks for being here, and I hope this symposium is helpful to you as we push this field forward. Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Jamie Wikowiak, who is currently General Counsel at Instill Bio. Jamie is no stranger to this group. In fact, I see her as one of the founding members of the MDIC EFS initiative. This came from her close collaboration with Mike Mack when she was at Baylor Research Institute, where she was responsible for really running the day-to-day operation there, as well as really championing their EFS effort. Her bona fides, if that wasn't enough, were further strengthened by coordinating the workshop meeting, which is, I think, the first MDIC meeting in this area, where she brought together representatives from sites and sponsors, really the legal counsel from both of those entities, from a number of them, brought them together in one room for 2 days to really help, hammer out wording for agreements that are now being used all over the place and are in the toolbox that the MDIC provides, which I urge everyone to utilize. The other key thing about that meeting was that though Jamie seems very pleasant, it was pretty clear that physicians and PIs were not really invited, that they really wanted us out of the room, and boy, were they productive. So with that background, also Jamie recently left Baylor to become General Counsel at Instill Bio, which just filed their S1 and went public. Congratulations. So I think it's really a good time to talk with you, Jamie. First to talk a little bit or a lot about your experience at Baylor, and then we'll touch a little bit on your new perspective from the sponsor side of the equation. Let's get started. You ran Baylor Research Institute, a huge endeavor that really bread and butter was running pivotal trials. So you talk to me a little bit from your perspective from the site, what made for a pivotal trial success? And then after we've established that, how does working in the EFS space differ?
Sure thing. And Dr. Kaplan, thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm just thrilled to be able to speak to you about this. So we had a well-run machine, a clinical trial machine. We ran several pivotal trials, and we knew how to do that well, from working with our IRBs to making sure we put the right team members in place to run that trial, and also picking and working with your principal investigators and then any sub-investigators on that. So I feel like we had it down. And then EFS came along. And that's when we started having questions from our IRBs. They weren't used to looking at, let's say, animal data and not like data from this device being used in actual humans. And also there were questions about the contract. Intellectual property language was questioned, study subject injury language was questioned. There were differences in the consent forms because a lot of things were so unknown. And even with the device itself, you could still end up tweaking the device depending on what you learned from those first few cases. And so there were some changes to the way we ran research, and we had to pivot and really develop that close relationship with the company to fully understand what we were getting ourselves into with early feasibility studies. So I think that was the big difference.
So let's just take those one thing at a time.
Yep.
So IRB,
Yes.
Is this just kind of communication, or are there some other kind of key elements to success there?
Communication and education. I think education was extremely important. And even at MDIC, we put together a one-pager for IRBs that you could share with them, explaining what EFS is and the importance of EFS. And so I think that was really, really helpful. And having that dedicated principal investigator that can go to the IRB meeting, that can meet with the staff members there, that can meet with the board members and actually inform them and tell them what we're trying to accomplish and answer any questions on the spot. I think that was really key to getting these studies approved.
And then on the negotiating side, did that require different counsel, or how did you work to thread that needle?
So the first step was reading the guidance that came out from the FDA. And I was, lucky enough to be working with Dr. Mack at the time, and he called me and said, "Here, read this. You need to understand it." And that really helped set the stage in having those discussions. So usually you go back and forth with clinical trial agreements just through email. You send your red line changes, counsel on the other side reviews it. We really had to have a discussion about some of these key terms in the clinical trial agreement to actually get to yes, to actually get that agreement signed for our site. So that was really helpful, but having that guidance was also really important.
If you got a phone call from a site today who was taking that on, and the person who was could be at the point of the spear to get that done for a site, for argument's sake, a similar size and stature of Baylor, what would be your one piece of advice for them?
I would say, who is your physician champion? Because that is so key. You need a physician champion for this, because it's going to take them time to work with the different groups, to work with the IRB, to work with legal to answer any questions. And I think that's so important. And also, I would say you need to understand that these patients are special. All patients are special, but these patients, they are signing up for something. And you have to be there and available and hold their hand along the way. And so you want to make sure that you have that team in place and that you're available to them at all hours. If there's any adverse events, if there's, if they want to reach out and have questions or just a call about something that's going on, I think that is so important, because it is, a lot of times the first time this device is being used in a patient. And so it's that relationship, I think, is a little extra special there.
While we're on that, and how special some of these are, especially the very first clinical use, any kind of advice about managing kind of the media around that? And was there kind of a plan to just keep everything embargoed? Just talk about that a little bit.
So we would always work with the sponsors on that. From the sponsor perspective, we wouldn't discuss anything with the media unless we ran that by our sponsor for an EFS study. There were times that we wanted to do a video of a patient, or a patient would come forward and say, "I am so happy that I participated in this EFS study, and I would love to tell everyone else about it and educate them." We would even bring that patient forward to the sponsor to say, here's someone that would love to share their experience and talk to us about EFS studies. And I think it's really important for sites, for sponsors, for the community to hear from those patients, because they're the ones that experienced it personally.
So interesting. As we wrap up, you've now moved and you're on the sponsor side. What has been the biggest surprise from that perspective?
Clinical trial agreements, and I did them all the time, at Baylor from the site perspective. So now I'm on the sponsor side, and I just find that it really does take a long time to get to yes, to get to that agreed upon language. And I'm just asking sites to get on the phone and let's work it out. And I know that's an hour of time, but I think it saves 10 hours and, probably 6 weeks of time if we just actually get on a call and discuss the issues and explain why we're changing some of the language or requesting some language. I think that is so key. And it's just funny to me how challenging it is to get these agreements signed off on, because there is so much back and forth.
And is there anything from the sponsor perspective that you're seeing that is looming larger now than you perceived it from the site perspective?
You know, I think when EFS came about, we started to see more and more discussion and changes related to the intellectual property language.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm seeing that now just across the board with all studies, just the intellectual property language being highly negotiated. They don't want it, sites don't want it too overreaching that it could basically impact some other projects that they're working on at the site level. And that's completely understandable. And sponsors want to make sure that their product is completely covered and anything related to it is covered. And so striking that fine balance has been more challenging.
Interesting. Well, you know, I see that unfortunately our time is coming to a close, and I think, you know, finishing on concepts of finding balance is a good way to do that. So with that, Jamie, congratulations on your IPO and your new position, and also very pleased to see that you're continuing to work with the EFS community, and we really look forward to collaborating with you going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaplan.
Hi, everybody. This is Chip Hance. I'm here to moderate our next roundtable discussion. We've got a terrific panel, small company perspective, large company perspective, a site perspective, and a clinician's perspective, together with CMS perspective. And I think it'll be a really engaging conversation. Let's set the stage first, and I'm going to turn it over to John Hunt, who is Vice President of Clinical Science for MDIC, to talk about the metrics that have been established over the last couple of years on how these studies actually get conducted within the U.S. So, John, hand it over to you, please.
Thank you, Chip. I'm going to talk briefly about the metrics that MDIC established with our stakeholders from the ecosystem related to early feasibility studies. And as you can see, about 3 years after FDA wrote their guidance on early feasibility studies, MDIC started to get really involved in this process, and as far back as 2016. And one of the things we wanted to establish were what were the key administrative tasks that potentially could slow down this process for any company involved in early feasibility studies. So what we did was we conducted a survey anonymously for the participants, obviously, because some of the information is proprietary to companies, related to clinical trial agreements, informed consent, and the contracting and budgeting process. And you'll see a link at the bottom of this slide, which will circulate with our follow-up email on feedback for this device related to those tools that we've created. So, so what we found was very interesting, because after completing the survey in 2017 to baseline how these various tasks could be handled, we went ahead and then repeated that survey in 2019. And you can see some of the tools we've developed along the way listed on this slide. But let me go to this slide, which I think really provides the detail. And these solid bars in this histogram represent our 2017 baseline here. And we established what we called a 60-60-60 goal. So 60 days for IDE approval, 60 days for IRB approval, and 60 days for contract and budgeting approval. And these histograms represent how well we did as an ecosystem in that process. So you can see that in 2017, based on data through the 2014-2017 period, IDE approval was just a little over 60 days at 68. IRB approval was at 72 days. Contract approval, as Jamie just alluded to, was 133 days, primarily tied up in the contract language and everything else. And then the modeled histograms to the right here actually reflect the 2019 results that we collated. And you can see that with regard to the IDE approval, IRB approval, we're meeting that 60-day goal. And we'd always contemplated that the IRB and contracting could be done in parallel, so in one 60-day window. And then what we were measuring was then overall time to first enrollment. And you can see this is here in 2017, markedly improved in 2019. So overall, what this meant was in 2017, the median time to get an EFS through this process was around 320 days. So a relatively long runway, much of it tied up obviously in the contracting and budgeting process. And then by 2019, that had dropped dramatically now to 252 days. So still requires advanced planning, obviously. But I can tell you from my own personal experience, having run a number of EFS studies in my career, as Jamie just pointed out in her interview with Aaron, actually getting involved in the contract process early and having people talk to one another rather than exchanging emails can save weeks and weeks of negotiation. The other thing I would encourage a lot of startups to consider also is for some centers, some language may be non-negotiable in a contract. It's good to ask that question at the beginning of the process rather than going back and forth multiple times between attorneys only to find out that something's non-negotiable. So we anticipate, obviously this is our estimate, that with the right engagement and communication, we can actually take this down to around, our estimate this year between Chip, Rick, Jeffrey-on, and myself is about 90 days, still up well over the 60 days. But I think, again, that's something we obviously will continue to work on. But you can see that this picture and the support from the FDA staff that's run by Andy Farb and guidance and leadership from Dr. Sherin, this is very appealing from a company's perspective that the U.S. environment has become a lot more favorable to conduct early feasibility studies. So, I think the challenge still remains a little bit to be resolved is the contracting and budgeting. But again, I think it's something that we're seeing based on the tools we've developed for the Master Clinical Trial Agreement, for example, the Informed Consent form template. We've had a number of success stories which we publish in our EFS Express, which I'd encourage you all to, if you haven't accessed it, to go on our website and access that. And we'll be sending a link out post this meeting for you to look at some centers that are doing this process extremely well, where FDA and IRBs obviously are both comfortably under this 60-day goal. And we're seeing that centers that actually are good at this are able to meet this 60-day goal on the budgeting and contracting quite comfortably as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Chip and look forward to getting your feedback.
Thanks, John, and hope you'll join us as part of the conversation. Before we get into our dialogue, we've got a survey question here to kick us off. So what is the largest stumbling block associated with a U.S. EFS study? So you choose one. Is it IDE approval, IRB approval, site contracts, understanding reimbursement, or subject recruitment? And while you're filling that out, and we'll bring those results up in just a moment, I would just add, Jeff Sherin mentioned at the beginning that much of this early clinical research had left the U.S., and these administrative practices that are part of the ecosystem for conducting these studies, once the FDA made it a more streamlined process, actually getting a study up and going, compared to other places around the world where a sponsor could conduct a study, became real issues for why someone would want to choose the United States to conduct a study. And so work in this area was really critical, and will continue to be critical to have an attractive ecosystem to bring these kinds of novel devices to the U.S. So let's pull up the results here. So I don't think you'll all be surprised, but more than 50% of you still highlight that the negotiations between sites and sponsors continues to be the most significant issue, followed by understanding reimbursement. So Steve, that's terrific you've joined us here today, subject to recruitment, et cetera. So let's go around the panel and just comment, first of all, from each of your perspectives, what are the one or two things that make EFS different, kind of a key issues list? And let's start with you, Michael, from a small company's perspective. You've run EFSs and know firsthand the challenges.
Sure. So thank you, Chip and John. Just to note that we've got three topics to discuss today: indemnification, which is just one part of the site selection process, patient recruitment, and reimbursement. And those are three key topics. Just a comment about FDA in response to Dr. Sherin's presentation earlier is, sites need to develop a collaborative working relationship with FDA. We have had one, and that has been our success. Before you start, I would highly recommend that you identify somebody on your team who can, from the clinical or regulatory perspective, who either has that relationship with FDA reviewer or can establish one in a short period of time. That has led to our success in obtaining FDA review and approval of each of our EFS programs in 30 days, or even less in 2 cases. So site selection is key, and it's only, indemnification and the contract part is only part of that site selection. I think what makes this critical is that, in an EFS program, FDA is going to limit your sample size. Ours were limited to 15 subjects each. And for this, we were allowed up to 5 sites. This is critical in your site selection process. Work with your key opinion leaders or KOLs as you develop and design your protocol and have them help you identify key centers. You will need a champion, one or more champions at each center who fully support your program, because that champion may be the investigator who drives the project. It may be the person who is involved in meeting with other stakeholders, other investigators, and your IRB. Sites need to have experience working on EFS programs. They need to have the ability to work quickly to review and execute those clinical trial agreements. Proprietary technology is key. Indemnification is key. And then they also need to be able to move quickly with their review board, whether it's an institutional board or a centralized board. And we had one issue with sites where we had 5 sites. 3 were up within 6 months of receiving FDA approval letter, but one took 18 months to go live, and that certainly impacted our ability to enroll. And that brings us to patient recruitment. Can't stress this enough. You need to pick sites that have the patient population to treat the patients for the therapy that you're targeting, but you need to make sure you have the right players involved. Patient volume isn't enough. We were investigating patients who suffered from functional mitral regurgitation as a result of their heart failure diagnosis, and we discovered 12 months in we weren't targeting the heart failure doc. We were focused only on the interventional docs. So that's key. Reimbursement. FDA will grant you a Category A classification for your program, or they may grant you one. So what does this mean? It means that any assessment or test that is considered standard of care, up to and including the implant procedure, may be covered by Medicare. For a small startup like ours, this is critical. Leverage this by requesting CMS coverage. Medicare will not cover the investigational device for Category A, but it certainly will have an impact on your budget. You may be able to save as much as $30,000 to $50,000 per subject. If you haven't worked with reimbursement or CMS in the past, hire a knowledgeable consultant. Site selection, patient recruitment, and reimbursement are all elements to make your EFS program successful.
Right. Michael, thanks. Hey, Jill, you've got the experience from a large company, Edwards, and I think Michael covered a lot of key points. What would be one or two that would be different from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a great just overall summary in terms of how the impacts on the whole process have worked. But I do think that there are a couple of things that we've discovered over conducting a lot of different EFS programs over the years that have kind of surprised us, even from the big company perspective. One, we talked a lot about contracting in some of the earlier discussions, and so of course contracting has been a significant challenge. Putting a master clinical trial agreement into place is something that has helped us to speed up the process, but that's something that is, it allows us to conduct multiple studies at a given institution. But every single study is going to have its own budget, and the budget will be different from one trial to the next. So some of the budgeting challenges that we've discovered are that, especially when you have a really novel procedure, something that's very different that has never been done before, there are things that you don't necessarily know going into it. For example, you might need extra time in the procedure room, or the echo that you're going to do is going to take you 3 times as long as a normal procedure. I mean, there are a number of things that can come up where that can be an obstacle from the site perspective for them to conduct the study. So ideally, you want to try to identify those things up front as much as you can, and to build in something into your contract to be able to support that. We've also discovered that, with EFS, there's learning that happens with every single patient that you treat. Every patient can actually result in some small change to your overall process. And so if that change results in a protocol amendment, then there's a whole cascade of events that goes along with that. A new IRB submission, a new consent, possibly a new budget. So you have to make sure that you're flexible and able to adapt to that as well. And those have been some of the things that I think are some of the key challenges that we've had to overcome. And certainly having really great partners at our clinical sites helps us to do those things very quickly as much as possible.
Great, thanks, Jill. And Lynn, you're one of those great partners at Northwestern Hospital in Chicago, and you've got a lot of experience in conducting EFS, been through an extensive learning curve. What's one key issue that jumps out for you that's been a significant learning?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to present our experience. This is exciting space, and we've learned that collaboration and flexibility are essential. One thing with institutions as sites, it's important that you have institutional buy-in. There's so many unknowns, and we've got to be able to navigate the IRB, navigate budgets, and the reimbursement is unknown. If you don't have everyone on board, there's delays. And Jill's statement about budgets is very true. There's a lot of unknowns, and we essentially roll out the budget to the best of our ability and then move forward and adjust if necessary. There's always going to be the need for flexibility and the need to work with IRB with really strong regulatory people who can navigate this and partner with the clinicians and the research staff. Quite frankly, when you move forward with an EFS trial, it's not just the research staff, it's the full administration, clinical, and research team. And that's what it really takes for success, and the ability to step back with each procedure and look at where the opportunities are for process improvement. That's really critical for the long-range positioning.
That's great. Well, you shouldn't be modest. You've achieved less than 60 days, sometimes less than 30 days on these sponsor contract negotiations. So it's clear you make it a priority in your institution. Tamim, you've been a site PI at Columbia, and so you've enrolled these studies. What makes them different? What's the challenges from your perspective?
Well, I agree with much of what's been said by Lynn and the others. EFS offer us a unique, really exciting opportunity to bring our patients these new innovative therapies for diseases that in some cases aren't able to be treated at all, or certainly not adequately treated. And so it's one of the most exciting things that we can do as clinicians, but also brings with it these important challenges that we're talking about today. And I think if there's one word that sort of sums it all up to me, it's uncertainty. As a clinician dealing with the patients as the first aspect, we're used to the type of trials where you can really have a much more detailed discussion with your patients about expectations, about timelines, the definite nature of the treatment, the outcomes, and this is just a whole new realm of uncertainty. So, I start out from that patient perspective. As a researcher, there's also ample uncertainty, right? The timelines are often unclear. Sometimes there's starting and stopping, waiting for approvals at the FDA level, at the IRB level. So managing these timelines can be a big challenge for us. I think if there are things that we've learned that can help us to be successful, I think they are flexibility in dealing with the sponsors, in dealing with the timelines, and in dealing really with the patients and their families. Along with flexibility, I think it takes substantial resources and communication. These studies can be very, very resource intensive for us. It takes more work for us to get them through the contracting phase, more work and time to partner with the IRBs and have a successful IRB approval. Certainly more work in screening the patients, presenting them to trial screening boards, getting them approved, additional time, multiple meetings, communicating with the patients around the expectations and so on. So I think to have this flexibility and the resources to move successfully through these processes is something that's necessary to be successful in this area. So I think everything that's been mentioned has to come together just right to have a successful program.
Thanks, Tamim. So Steve, I want to give you the floor. It's interesting to watch how EFS has evolved over the last 7 years or so. And in the beginning, it was a new effort on the part of CMS, and now it's evolved to be more significant and a more routine process, I believe, for you. But maybe you can comment a little bit about how it's evolved from a CMS perspective and what you think the current issues are.
Well, so first I would say that CMS is by its very nature an insurance company, and we deliver coverage for defined benefits that are expressed in the law about what we can and cannot cover. And that has implications because early feasibility studies in Category A devices are expressly experimental, which is an explicit exclusion from our ability to cover those devices themselves. That said, CMS does have the legal ability to cover the routine costs associated with delivery of Category A and early devices in early feasibility studies, and those early feasibility studies can sort of graduate to an IDE application where both the device and the routine costs may be covered. So what makes EFS studies different from a CMS perspective is the way the law is written, and the fact that we explicitly cannot cover the device itself as long as it's categorized as an experimental device, which it inherently is if it's a first in human.
Great.
I think that we do have a good deal of experience in working with these IDE applications, and in 2020, even during the public health emergency, CMS received 124 applications for IDEs, of which 78.2% were ultimately approved, and of those, 108 of the 124 were Category A submissions. Of the Category A submissions, 65.7% were approved. So many of the submissions in this category ultimately enjoy approval. I should say too that 15.7% of those 108 were withdrawn, and they weren't disapproved; they were just withdrawn. So, yeah, I realize that this is a very challenging space, and that there is an incredible amount of complexity and uncertainty, has been echoed by multiple other speakers. We are here to support our sister agencies in advancing the science. However, fundamentally, we're a payer and we are subject to the law.
Great, great. Jill, you've done so many of these EFSs. Thinking about CMS reimbursement, which is usually your patient population you're considering, how has it evolved from your perspective, and has it gotten more simpler, or what's your approach now?
Yeah, it's actually evolved quite a bit since the very first EFS that we conducted at Edwards. You know, in our first EFS, we were still in the pre-2015 timeframe where CMS was covering everything. And so that's evolved to the point now where we have this Category A reimbursement. And so we have to take into consideration, we have to make sure that we build into our budget and into our plans the fact that we are going to have to be able to cover the device itself. But, you know, as we were talking about earlier, there are some of these other aspects that, you know, that kind of are on the border, and it's an unknown to us in CMS and to the site perspective when you have really a very different procedure. You know, if there's something that's particularly novel about it, then that doesn't necessarily fall into that normal Category A reimbursement. And so we have to think really carefully, step by step, through our procedures and try to figure out how much of this is really a standard of care part of the procedure and how much of this is really different and something that we as the company need to make sure that we are covering from that perspective. And I mean, that can really make the difference in terms of your ability to recruit patients. Because if you know, even with the big hospital systems that we work with, you know, if they really can't dedicate the time because we're asking them to absorb all of those extra costs on their end, then they're not going to be really excited about recruiting patients for us. So especially for us from our perspective, if we can do anything to pave the way for our clinical sites on that end, then that's going to help us to make sure that we can maximize our recruitment.
So if you can't get CMS reimbursement, are you left with the decision of, do you pay for it yourself as a large company for the costs? And Tamim's not its head as well. What are you seeing, Tamim, with some of the sponsors when CMS reimbursement isn't there?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You know, if the procedures or the hospitalizations are not reimbursed, we've had very difficult discussions with the sponsors about exactly that. And many new devices will treat patient populations that are quite sick and may require things like ICU stays, extended hospitalizations, and so on. So that could be a very expensive proposition. And it has led to very substantial delays in some cases in our ability to get started with certain programs. The other sort of financially challenging thing for us is this issue of compassionate use. You know, there can sometimes be some overlap in the new devices between the devices being used in a feasibility study versus in certain populations in a compassionate use basis. And compassionate use cases take also a substantial amount of work for us, a lot of resources. Again, working with the sponsor to get FDA approval, working with the IRB at the institution to get IRB approval, and then communicating again with the patients and getting the treatment. And in those cases, we're not reimbursed at all. So, you know, again, it goes to the point that the reimburses and finances can be very challenging.
Good. Well, I think it's been a pretty consistent issue. And Steve, I've heard from a number of companies this concept that if you've moved past, call it 5 patients successfully treated, and you're, you know, safe, good outcomes, that you move beyond the experimental stage, if you will, from a perspective of CMS. Is that generally your advice? Is that about right?
That historically that's been the case, and I think you can shift from experimental to investigational, which opens up additional reimbursement pathway options in the context of a clinical study.
Great, good, okay. Well, that's something to develop further. Let's. The number one topic was contracting as terms of an issue, and we sort of heard from Jamie Wikowiak up front, picking up the phone and having a dialogue between a site and a sponsor to rapidly resolve issues versus doing it via the email approach can be a lot more effective. Lynn, what's been your experience on quickly resolving, since you've got such a great track record as a site?
I would definitely recommend getting on the phone. The bottom line is, when we submit a contract for an EFS study to our contracts office, we call and explain that this is an early feasibility study and it is unique, and please pull us in early. If we need to get you on the phone with the sponsor, we'll get on the phone. Additionally, master agreements are essential. They've been extremely beneficial in the areas that we have them, and have allowed us to move forward quickly with many industry partners. So as a site, how many are master clinical trial agreement sponsors do you have? And what about the MDIC master clinical trial agreement? The MDIC master agreement has been very helpful with some of the startups, and our institution was on board with development of that. So with startups, that's been extremely helpful, and it's allowed us to move forward quickly with some of the startup companies. With some of the larger industry partners, we have master agreements in place, and it really allows us to get to the finish line quickly. It really, if there's anything unique, we can address it, but the focus really changes to addressing the budget rather than the fine line of the agreement. It makes life much easier for everyone and much more efficient. Jill, do you have any comments in that area? I know we have a master agreement with Edwards, and that's been very helpful in our partnership there.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, just really the same thing. Having those early discussions, even as you're negotiating the master, is something that's really important. One of the things that sites will consider as they're negotiating a master clinical trial agreement is this is something that's going to impact everything from early feasibility all the way through post-market studies. And so they have to be willing to accept whatever risk level we're putting into that contract, whether it is for that very, very risky early trial, or hopefully for something that's later on that, where it's a really well understood therapy. So those early conversations, I think, are very helpful from that perspective. We do find that, I think that, indemnification liability, those are very challenging discussions to have in the earliest stages. And then also publication rights are something that we argue over a lot, because there are, many of the larger academic institutions want to own that right. And of course, the large sponsors, and I'm sure the small ones as well, have a very, important vested interest in that as well.
Any more of the panelists want to comment about contracting improvements? Well, I think we're almost coming to the end. So we do have, we have over 200 people listening, and a good number of them represent prospective sponsors who are considering doing an EFS in the U.S. Going forward. So if you could pick just one tip that you would suggest to them, what might it be? Maybe Steve, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, the first step is going through all the regulatory approvals at the FDA, for sure, and which is in their space. But the coverage and analysis group routinely works with sponsors to assure that we can get clarity on approval for the appropriate reimbursement pathway wherever it's possible. So we're here to support and engage with sponsors, and hope that we are helpful in that regard.
Terrific. Tamim?
Sorry, I was muted there. I would say know your sites and get in early and communicate. I think that it's important to ask the sites what type of experience they have in EFS prior, what hurdles they have had, what prospective patient population, how they'll be able to enroll, and not to wait till you're sort of ready to get rolling, but to start those conversations early and really get to know your sites, I think is critical.
Great. Michael, a final word of advice?
Sure. I would certainly say to folks to ensure that you've identified key team members, whether it be the research nurse coordinator, the investigator, other stakeholders at the site, your FDA reviewer, your reimbursement expert, to ensure that you set a good foundation for success.
Great. And Lynn, some key suggestions, especially for a site thinking about EFS?
Well, as a site, one of the important areas is really to look at the screening and recruitment. It is such a significant lift in contrast to your other studies. The research team needs to be fully involved. And then when you move to consenting patients, it's a process and it is significant. Having screening consents is essential. For most of these studies, you're looking at consents that are maybe 20 to 25 pages long for the full consent process. So having a screening consent so you can do initial screening without addressing 25 pages of information with the patient is really helpful. It's too overwhelming for patients. So I would highly suggest looking at screening and refining screening procedures.
So, Jill, maybe I'll phrase the question slightly differently for you. So if we haven't scared everyone away with the challenges of running an EFS in the U.S., why are you doing studies in the U.S. First and foremost?
No, that's a great question. The U.S. offers us a lot of opportunities that that we don't have when we do global feasibility work. The first and foremost, the easy one is that it's close to home. It's a lot easier for us to we heard it here from I think Michael that, or from somebody, maybe it was Aaron earlier, that if you have a clinical site that's within a couple of miles of you that you can partner with, that you can get to back and forth quickly, that's something that's really, really valuable and powerful. Making sure that you are working, under the same regulatory umbrella and that you're working under the same language. All of these things are things that factor into your ability to be successful. And so, it's a phenomenal process. But I would say that our collaboration that we've had with the FDA all the way through this process, going back to the first early feasibility that we've had, is nothing like anything we've ever experienced before. And it's that early collaboration is something that takes you not just through early feasibility, but into your pivotal trials and then into your approvals. And that is just invaluable to us, for us to be able to have that opportunity. So we're really grateful for the opportunity to have this program.
Great. Well, Jill, thank you. And thanks to all our panelists. I have to say, this is a very collaborative community, and wherever you are around the globe thinking about an EFS, you'd be surprised at how accessible, whether it's our panelists or many others, are to giving advice, friendly advice on how to conduct these studies. And people are here to help you try and consider doing something different. So with that, let me turn it back to Aaron. Thanks for this opportunity to have this panel.
Well, it's a terrific pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Ian Meredith, to the EFS Symposium. I believe most of the people in the audience know Ian from his role as the Global Chief Medical Officer at Boston Scientific. But many people don't know that prior to that, he was the leading investigator at Monash Medical Center in Melbourne, which he helped to establish as among the, if not the, global site for doing early feasibility testing, both during the early days of drug-eluting stents and then during the early days of structural heart, particularly with TAVR devices. So I thought it'd be particularly interesting to have Ian on for him to share his perspectives both over the last 5 years at Boston Scientific, and then contrast those with his perspective that he had from in the trenches running a program. Ian, welcome.
Thanks very much, Aaron. It's really a pleasure to be part of this program, and so I'm honored to be involved.
Well, terrific to have you. Let me get started. And really what I want to do is there are really two things I want to probe in this interview. First is your perspective or perspectives from your different roles of what makes a good site for a pivotal trial, and then contrast that with what makes a good site for a EFS study. And then at the end, very interesting how your perspective may have changed with your role as a corporate leader. So let's just jump right in. You were the director of, I think, the Cath Lab and the Heart and Lung Institute at Melbourne. I probably have the terminology not quite correct. And just talk to me about what you thought the key elements of your success was in terms of participations in pivotal trials.
Well, it's interesting that you asked a contrast between pivotal trials and early feasibility or first-in-human studies, because there's a lot of similarities. There are just a few extra features you're looking for in first-in-human studies. But the overarching thing that I would say, Aaron, is that you have to recognize that being involved in these clinical trials is a privilege, not a right. And once you recognize, whether it's pivotal or an EFS, that it is indeed a privilege to be involved, and that you have to actually contribute as a meaningful partner in a timely fashion, then I think that really defines overall what the characteristics of how the site should be and how you behave as a trialist or a contributor to that study. It's really about quality, time, and cost, and making sure that you provide the most quality that you possibly can in timely information, and do it at a reasonable cost to the sponsor.
Talk to me, we talked about partnering. Talk to me about that, because I know that all the COI talk that there is, and all the issues in terms of monitoring COI, people see partnering perhaps as a four-letter word. So talk to me about that, both at a pivotal as well as an EFS perspective.
You know, it's a very good point, and it is all about partnership, and partnership. I love to use these series of P words, because I think what does partnership really mean between a sponsor of a clinical trial and you as a site? And it really is about your personal involvement. You can't delegate the responsibility for these critical trials to subordinates or other ordinates in your organization. You have to take personal involvement. You have to be available. You have to communicate with those sites and that are other sites that are involved in the trial. And you have to be a great communicator with your internal team and patients. So it's about personal involvement, it's about passion for the product, it's about patience and perseverance, it's about preparedness and preparation and practice, so that you do the procedure well when you come to actually do it. And the last but not, and probably the most important, is what I like to say is perspicacity, that clarity of vision that can actually assist the sponsor with the enhancing the clinical trial, particularly in the early feasibility studies, that clarity of thought and vision that allows you to actually make a meaningful contribution above and beyond just recruiting patients into the study. So really, partnership to me is all of those P's. It's not, I want to work with you, so therefore we are partners. And I would say it really hasn't changed from my view on the, if you like, on the side as an investigator to what I look at now as potential collaborator investigators from the industry side. We're looking for the same things. We're looking for sites that provide quality and in its broadest dimension, that do things in a timely fashion, that are available and communicate with us, and have a reasonable understanding of or a commitment to minimizing the direct and indirect costs associated with these, because these studies are enormously expensive, as you know.
Yeah, and that, I think the idea of partnership for me, it plays out differently in the EFS domain, where I think that the ability, and I've taken this from my own startup experience, a very accomplished proceduralist, some can work well with engineers, and some in a collaborative fashion, and some look at the device and are already telling the engineers how it works. Can you talk to me how that plays out, and advice for investigators out there to how to be more effective?
Exactly, and I think you've nailed it, really. And this comes down to the passion part of it. You have to have a passion for the field, a passion for the technology, understand what makes something easy to use, how you should be able to look at it and say, how could you simplify this? How could you improve the training? How can you reduce the number of steps in the procedure? So you have to be a good communicator. You have to have passion for it. And you have to recognize that when a new product, a new technology comes, it's going to be complex because it is new and it's potentially in a new field. And that requires collective wisdom to bring that to clinical fruition through improving the device per se, the procedure, or even the way we educate and train. So it is that form of partnership and collaboration that we're looking for in the EFS partners, because we're not going to have it right to start with. And this, as I've often said, this is a newborn infant, and I'm asking you to nurture and look after my newborn infant, and that requires a fair degree of insight.
So it's the idea, one of my engineering buddies says, it's always wrong the first time, we have to get wet. And in this setting, wrong is defined, about, how you set up a shot or how you use something, and really drilling down. I want to change a little bit and focus a little bit on your role when you were back in Monash. It always was a little bit, didn't quite make sense to me that why is everyone talking about going to Australia? And I think there's the remoteness may have worked in your favor. So talk about why, especially about 10 years ago in the early TAVR days, why was everyone traveling down to Australia, and what were the key elements that you set up to really have that welcome mat so nicely placed?
Well, thank you. And it's hard to, I got involved in early feasibility studies in the early 90s when I returned from the US. I was at the Brigham and returned, and I thought I could be part of very large multi-center trials, or I could focus on something I was generally interested in, the interface between new technology, engineering, and the clinical applications. But I quickly realized in order to do that, you had to be a good communicator, open, available, and you needed to actually surround yourself with like-minded individuals. So you had to build a culture of this is what we're going to do, not only internally in your own institution, but a group of collaborating partners. And so when we set out in the mid-90s to really take on stents and then drug-eluting stents and other technologies, left atrial appendage closure devices. It was about building a consortium of like-minded individuals around the country, and then saying, how are we going to market ourselves and target particular trials, and then make sure that we deliver on what we do. And so, for instance, as you know, there was one first in human trial with a TAVR device where I said, if you bring it to Australia, we will do the entire study in 1 week. Now that was a brash and perhaps bold move, but we did. And I traveled around the country and met with the sites and said, can you guarantee that you will do 3 on the day when the sponsors are actually here? Yes, these are the characteristics of the patients we want, and we did 3, 4, 3 and did the 10 patients in 5 days. So it was, and this is where the passion and the commitment come into it, I think, really. So we built up a reputation for quality research, and in its broadest ramifications, safe, effective, traceable, accountable, all of the right words that you'd want to hear for quality, and doing it in a timely fashion and in a cost-efficient way. And I think those are the fundamental underpinnings of what you're looking for at a site. Now, we live in a wonderful world here in the US now. We have this fantastic foundation for early feasibility studies because of the collaborations of FDA, CMS, MDIC, and there's a general spirit and willingness to bring this together. But ultimately, it comes down to the sites actually delivering on that foundation, and that's what I think we essentially established in Australia.
Well, it's hard for me to think that we're already done with our time. We're a little bit over. So I think just to sum up, it's really about commitment. It's about communicating and partnering. With that, unfortunately, our time is up. It was terrific to see you, if only virtually, and look forward to seeing you in person, and really appreciate your personal support to the space. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. It's a pleasure. It's a very exciting time for early feasibility studies.
Well, it's a real pleasure to welcome my friend Jeff Pamela to this symposium. Jeff and I know each other we don't count them in years, apparently we count them in decades. And over that time, it's been a real thrill to watch Jeff. We first met each other as we were fellows. And from being a fellow in Michigan, he really has accomplished a phenomenal amount. Before joining Medtronic, he ran the interventional cardiology and structural heart program at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center at Harvard Medical School, which really capped his academic career, having been central to the core lab analysis of many coronary interventions, most notably bare metal and drug-eluting stents, and then more recently being right at the tip of the spear in evaluating new TAVR technology, which really, I think, made it a very natural progression for him to move to Medtronic, where he's the vice president and chief medical officer, supporting coronary renal denervation and structural heart programs at Medtronic. And this kind of transitioning, going from leading a state-of-the-art cath lab and core lab to running programs from inside a company like Medtronic, I think provides Jeff with terrific perspectives to help us out here as we look at early feasibility testing. So let's just get started. I'll let you say something, I promise, Jeff. But I want you to talk about your perspective of really working hard to run a best-in-class pivotal a center that really contributed phenomenally to pivotal studies, and then talk about how that changes when you are a lab from the site perspective running early feasibility trials.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Aaron, for the invitation. It's great. We could go back to counting in years again anytime you want to. We don't want to get the decade number too high, but it has been a very great relationship over time. I think that's a very good question about what are the skills of a successful clinical site for pivotal, and what are the skills for a successful early feasibility site from our perspective. Look, I think it all starts around with collaboration, probably more than in the structural heart space than anywhere else. You have to build a team. And I was very fortunate at the Beth Israel Deaconess to have partners, Roger Laham, Dwayne Pinto, Kamal Kabaz, David Liu, a whole group, Kim Gabon, who ran our program. And those individuals really, as a team, make the success. And I think that is true for all the successful clinical sites that we have had. And I got to know extremely well during the CoreValve pivotal years, because it was the teams that made it happen, the collaboration, the thoughtfulness, the planning. And that's an incredibly important point, I think, for all of the clinical sites that are thinking about doing clinical trials, is that you can't do it as an island, you have to do it as a village. Moving into Medtronic, what we look for in clinical sites is the same thing. We look for the ability that the site can problem solve together. And that's been incredibly important as we think about the challenges of our new device therapies used for the first time, as well as making sure that there's a consistency with how all of our clinical trial results are expressed. So I think that the number one message I would give for both is teamwork and collaboration.
Great. And the surprises that you encountered when changing your perspective at Medtronic, both focusing on pivotal and EFS, was there any big surprise there, or is it, it's the basics still prevail?
Well, the teams are fundamentally important within Medtronic, and they're kind of different teams. One of the things that one learns when one moves into industry is the incredible depth of the quality of the data that needs to be presented and done. Maybe the rules are a little bit different for a startup as you move from startup to intermediate firm to large, that has a whole variety of product development plans that actually are implemented. But to move a new product through the large industry pieces, it takes a well-designed development plan that's approved at multiple stages, and it's all based on the execution of that plan. That plan involves the preclinical teams, it involves the evidence teams, it involves the marketing teams, it involves all the teams that function together in order to make things move forward. And I learned that what I felt were strengths at our clinical sites are now translated into industry with an incredible infrastructure to make sure that there's product iteration and quality all along the process.
Very interesting. I want to switch a little bit. So talk to me from a Medtronic perspective as you're looking at venue. It seems that Medtronic is spending a lot more of its EFS mind share in the U.S. And as the industry has, and it's a big focus of this meeting. So talk to me about how that plays out, implications for the development of a specific technology.
Yeah, it's been interesting. Through one of the two of those decades, everything changed for us, right? Something changed. And really from in the mid-2000s, we didn't really have the options for EFS in the United States, not the way that we do today. And so all the technology was done in Europe. And so if we take as an example CoreValve, and we learn what we learned from CoreValve, we didn't have EFS sites in the United States. And that when we started CoreValve, after our 3 roll-in patients, we were live for all of our 40 clinical sites. And so we had to import expertise, physician expertise, to teach us how to do CoreValve as a technique. And so we had phenomenal partners with Jean-Claude Laborde and Eberhard Gruber, and I'm going to leave them all up, but Hein Dannenberg and Yasser Mikev and Anders Johnson, that actually lived in the United States so that they could actually teach us. If you fast forward after the incredible implementation of EFS studies and look at what we're doing with our Intrepid program in transcatheter mitral, our early feasibility studies in mitral with Intrepid and in tricuspid, and we look at the teams that we've designated for our clinical sites here, it's absolutely outstanding, the quality of teams that we have. Because these teams have surgeons, they have echocardiographers, they have interventionalists, they have nurse practitioners, they have a whole beat of support so that we can do the 3 things that we need to do for early feasibility. We can learn about whether it's feasible. We can learn about whether it's safe. And most importantly, we can learn whether product iteration is needed before we move on to our pivotal trials. And that collaboration with the FDA has been unbelievable in terms of being able to transition some of these studies to the United States. And it's the best thing for the trials because we learn the experience that we then can give to our colleagues.
Yeah, it's so interesting that I don't think people realize that I think what keeps you up at night now is probably a little bit different than what kept you up at night running a cath lab. But that call of when something is ready to move forward into the pivotal is very tough. And any kind of insights about that transitioning, because that's one of the issues I hear from FDA. It's like, oh, the transition from EFS to pivotal should be more, seamless, and there's kind of a sputtering at times when you have to evaluate, re-look at something before you're ready to really jump into the kind of pivotal pool, if you will. So talk to me a little bit about that from a Medtronic and a personal perspective.
Well, first of all, again, we can't do this without the collaboration of the FDA. These interactive discussions back and forth are incredibly important because everything that we do is a risk-benefit discussion. And we have certain, within our system processes, within safety, we have levels of risks, and we know when we're in level 1 and level 2 and level 3 risks, and we know when we're in each of those different places, all defined by different components. But let's just take the 3 things that we need to understand as we move from EFS to pivotal. One is the product ready? We have to understand, does the product provide the performance that we would expect to see in a pivotal trial, knowing that now we're going against very mature comparative therapies, particularly in the mitral space. MitraClips are very, well-defined, well-characterized, well-performed technique. And so we would need to make certain that the product, with respect to deliverability, sheath size, kind of results that we get, reduction in regurgitation, are really ready so that we would not need additional device iteration. The second thing that we need to understand are the techniques that are used to implant the device. Are they interventionalist/surgeon ready? Now, our early feasibility study always leaves the opportunity that we can convert to surgery, and be able to help the patient to make sure if something gets in trouble. But we need to make certain that it's not just a single site that's extremely skilled can do it, but can the general sites do it? And the final thing that I think we have to understand is, do we have the teaching? Do we have the educational processes in place? Can we put together a set where we can actually train others to do it and be able to do it in a consistent fashion? So between the product, the operators, and the education, once all those metrics get ticked off, then I think we're ready to go to pivotal. But it's tough. It's tough to know exactly when that transition is, but we really have to understand that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I also think it's important for people to understand that there's a lot of thought that goes into this. Our time is up, unfortunately, but as we leave, if there was one area you would like sites in the community to focus on to help make this work a little bit more efficient, what would that be?
That's a very hard question. I'll be very frank about it, and that is that we have to have honesty and integrity from the sites to give us what they view as the advantages and the disadvantages in order for us to be able to product iterate better. Because we really have to have that ability to be able to communicate openly about what we think works, but probably as importantly or more importantly, what really doesn't work as we do product iteration.
So helpful. Well, Jeff, it was terrific to see you. Thank you for, I know now that you're in the corporate world, you have all this extra free time, and I'm glad we're able to use up some of that here, but very helpful. It's great to see you. Look forward to seeing you in person, and talk to you soon.
Good. Thanks, Aaron.
Hi, and welcome. Thanks, Aaron. And on behalf of my co-panelists, I'd like to welcome you all to our next session, which is expanding EFS beyond structural heart. What can we learn from our experiences to date? I think we're going to start with our polling question, if that could show that next. And that is, what has been the most important ingredients to the impressive growth of structural heart EFS in the U.S.? Choose one. It says required. I guess there are no abstentions allowed, but we'll let the folks vote, and then we'll move into our discussion. While folks are voting, if we could start to show those results, I'm pleased to have a panel that includes 3 clinical investigators that do cutting-edge research, in-house representatives from an industry that's doing an EFS, and then a medical consultant who has a vast experience in working with many sponsors in EFS. So here are the results, and it's looking like the established collaborative environment is the plurality here, with important elements of clinician advocates. Those are our clinician champions, and the nature of the clinical problem. So that's interesting. We can think about those as as potential framing elements during the discussion. So I wanted to start with a scenario, and we're going to pick on our clinician scientists, and we're going to have that you are the potential PI of an EFS involving a novel class 3 high-risk device that's a permanent implant, and it's a true first-in-human study. That is, it hasn't been tested outside the United States, or a prototype hasn't been tested, so the true first-in-human study to address an unmet need. You've been working with the sponsor, you've played around with the device in the animal lab, you're very enthusiastic, and you hear from the manufacturer that, as always, the process through the FDA is going extremely well. Streamlined, incredibly responsive, interacting with you, and that you can expect that the IDE will be approved in the next couple of weeks. And they want your opinion about, where to do the study. Of course, you will pick your site where you work, but 2 other sites need to fill out the N equals 15 patients, and there are 6 potential candidates. So for you, and again, we'll start with Vivek and move to Paul and Adnan. What are the special ingredients, or the sort of the secret sauce, if you will, that separates a successful EFS site from a dawdler or an unproductive site? And here, try to differentiate between an early phase study where we don't know that we're really in the early phase of learning about how to use this device. Vivek, why don't you lead off for us?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andy. First, thanks, Andy, for leading this, and thanks for allowing me to participate. I guess, look, there's some practical things, like some sites are up and running faster than others. So, for example, things like the use of external IRBs and that kind of stuff matters for getting the time to activation of a particular site. I think the interest level and commitment of the investigator at the site is probably the single most critical aspect of this. Sometimes when IRBs are slow or whatever, a motivated investigator can help with key aspects of getting things going. But I think probably, especially when it comes to EFS studies, it's a slightly different animal, right? In the sense that you're talking about typically a technology that has, obviously it has a good scientific rationale, but obviously also no clinical data. So you can't lean on OUS data to say it's already been used in X number of patients. And not all investigators feel comfortable with that, regardless of what they may say. They may not necessarily be able to transmit that comfort level and transmit it to the patients to be able to enroll in such a study. I don't know. I don't have an easy way of saying who's better at doing that than other people, other than looking at a history of being able to enroll in EFS type studies. And then the last aspect, and this is, of course, depends on the particular clinical situation, is you want to obviously have a site that has a lot of volume, because you're going to have a couple of sites. Every site that you pick is key, because if there's 3 sites and one site is a poor performer, then suddenly you've lost 30% of your capability of enrollment. So I think, having a site that has a lot of volume, that has a history of enrolling in trials in general, is very important.
So Adnan, given what you heard from Vivek, and please add to that, but also consider what you think is what elements go into that study quality equation. and then considering things like patient protection and the time to get going. What's your calculus here for, to pick those other sites, or even critically looking at your own site?
So thanks for really putting this thing together. The neuro guys are a little bit behind the structural heart guys in terms of the volume of early feasibility work that these guys have accomplished. They're trailblazers, and we are following in their wake. And we are grateful because the wake allows for a reduction of resistance to forward movement. And I think there's a real value to being in the behind the peloton here. But what I can see from my standpoint is the development of an ecosystem. And I think that's where this whole MDIC concept really has value and really needs to be supported and promoted, because I don't think any one entity by itself can overcome the kind of concerns that exist at individual levels and institutional levels with doing something which is a class 3 implant first time in a human being. You go to your clinical trials office and say, hey, I want to do this, and they say, what? How are you doing this? But if you come to them and you say, hey, this is in partnership with MDIC, and we have the FDA, and we have CMS, and we have big strategics, and we have these cutting edge institutions that have committed to it, and they have streamlined contracting and streamlined reimbursement. I think it's that ecosystem which is the secret sauce. I really believe that's been the one of the biggest reasons I believe structural heart's been so successful, is because you were able to mitigate the high risk features by taking the collaborative approach. And in fact, right before we started, that question that was put out by you clearly identifies that everybody understands the reason you've been successful is because you partnered with a lot of institutions. As far as specifically about what to look for in an institution, I think, again, it's a teamwork. You need to be relatively high volume. You need to be very used to doing clinical trials. You need to have a well-oiled machine. You need to have gone through a bunch of FDA audits and done well. So you know that you can conduct these trials with high rigor and high quality. I think those are all very important parts as a prelude to doing these first-in-man studies.
So Catherine, I'm gonna, it's similar. You're now on the manufacturer sponsor side. You have to pick your study PI. You have to consider the site PIs, and also, for 4C, you also considered U.S. and non-U.S. considerations in an EFS. So, thinking about study quality, time, patient protection issues, what goes into your thinking about that selection process?
Sure. So I think I couldn't agree more with our clinicians. So when we identify the sites, we of course start with clinicians, right, with our investigators. And EFS is the first in human study. That means that physician who actually will be helping us, he not only going to be doing a procedure, but he will be helping the company to a certain degree developing the product, right? In the first, second case, we're going to be learning for sure. And it takes a certain unique personality to be able to do that. It's much tougher to identify physicians like this maybe in Asia because they get in product much later. It is easier in the United States or Europe specifically. And also if we need to make a decision of where are we staying in the United States, because I absolutely love EFS process. As we're very grateful to FDA, and now PMDA in Japan adapted this process, and we exceptionally grateful. It makes industry life much, much easier. But at the same time, there are challenges in the United States. Even if you have the right sites with the right physicians, and I do believe we're going to get through IRBs and contracts, but at what cost? So earlier speakers and even our CMS representative, I think Stephen mentioned that they approved 65% of category A ID applications. And so EFS is a category A. And if you really truly do in first in human trial, it will be experimental according to CMS rules. And and it's not going to be reimbursed, but in order for you to go from category A experimental to category A investigational, you need to show CMS X number of patients with X months follow-up. Depending on the product, the requirements might be a bit different. And hence, in one hand, FDA or regulatory agency have done a great job helping industries to really bring the first in human trials into United States. On another hand, we still kind of have to go outside of United States to grab that very early X number of patients, 5, 10, and follow them before we could do something in the United States. If we don't, and if, big corporation can easily go ahead and do EFS in the United States and pick up the cost for small startup, especially like for 4C medical in the structural heart, our index procedure cost is at least $100,000. Plus, we have to pay for all of the complications. And someone brought in earlier ICU day stays and whatnot. First in human trial, you never know what may go wrong. And open-ended contracts in the United States for EFS forces the industry to cover all of the costs associated with those potential complications, whether they device related or not. As long as the patient is in the study, you're talking about not $1,000 or $2,000. You're talking about, a few $100,000 per patient. And small companies just can't afford it. So it's unfortunate that even though we do have a great ecosystem, I agree with it in the United States to do early feasibility study. Unfortunately, because of the lack in reimbursement, we often have to go and do some data collection outside of the United States first.
I don't see Paul in our window. I'm not sure if he can hear us. Paul, are you on the line?
Paul is not on the line.
Okay. So just, Catherine, just tell us a little bit about, the EFS are, fundamentally different from pivotal trials, and where the sponsor has a healthy distance between what's going on in the trial and the data to maintain the integrity for the statistical analysis. But EFS are a different animal altogether. Could you tell us what, for a small company like 4C, the involvement, the level of involvement that your group has in the actual day-to-day operations of EFS, monitoring the study, the progress, the adverse events, and then communicating those to us at FDA? What are the key elements of that relationship to the study?
Absolutely. So I think someone already brought up this point earlier. You have to have a very good relationship with FDA included, but also your IRB, your hospital, extremely high communication, because the things will happen and there will be challenges. And from a small company standpoint, I was smiling as you were asking the question. So when we do one of the first procedures, and maybe, right now it's a little bit more streamlined, but let's say for the first 10 cases, literally half the company, but our company is only 20 people. So literally half the company will be at the procedure, because everyone will be having a dedicated role, whether it's making sure that the training complete, making sure that someone is actually from an engineers and echo specialist proctoring the cases. Someone, to your point, will be immediately working with research coordinators after the procedure to enter the data and then monitor the data and have certain reportability requirements. Especially if you're doing global study, you have to report everything even outside of the United States. So it's extremely hands-on approach that is quite burdensome, but yet very rewarding, because hopefully you actually doing something, giving a patient an additional treatment opportunity, and it's exceptionally rewarding, but definitely with a lot of unknowns and quite hands-on, regardless of your title in the company.
Got it. So, Lauren, you've worked with numerous companies, many EFS. Take us a little bit upstream. You know, we've now to the process that's involved with you know, site selection, you know, good sites, because this is going to lead to the, you know, expansion of EFS beyond, you know, structural heart and other areas. When you think about quality, and also take us further upstream to your discussions about, you know, your knowledge across the spectrum of devices, U.S. versus non-U.S., and we will have a session that follows us on what's going on in the EU with the MDR. But what's that process like for you?
Yeah, I think the EFS as just sort of a baseline, any kind of first in human. I work with, as you know, a lot of companies that are some based in the US, but many based outside the US. So we focus on making sure that we think of the world as a kind of a small place right now, and finding not so much, you know, the quickest place in the world to get a study done, but really focusing on who the right practitioner is and who the right partner is. First in human studies really require a physician partnership with the engineering team, with the clinical research team, and that partnership is much different from first in human versus any kind of pivotal trial. You know, it's not a burn and churn. And, you know, in a lot of ways, a lot of structural heart projects have become almost simpler, I would say, because there's almost a methodology. Every product is different, though. Every device has a little nuance and needs special kind of training and proctoring. And that's where I like to make sure that the engineers and the physician are really working as a partner in terms of the development piece as well. I know Vivek is quite an example of that. He is really the senior statesman in EP for partnering with engineers. I've witnessed it myself. And also Vivek spends a lot of time outside the United States, really helping to get those first cases done, because as much, and I think Catherine articulated it well, as much as we want to partner with people in the United States, for many of my clients, it's just cost prohibitive to get those very first 5 patients to give to CMS in order to get the procedural costs covered. So I think that, and Adnan, I know, you know, the INR community is pretty small in the world, much different than interventional cardiology. And that little community has quite a presence in Europe. Outside the United States, there are some very, you know, big thought leaders in INR. So we partner with companies to make sure that they find the right clinician, the right practitioner, and whether it's somebody in the United States that has a passport with a lot of stamps on it, or people based in Europe, that we're going to go wherever the right physician is. And then we're going to still continue to involve discussions with FDA. At some point, you're going to need to go to the United States, and I like getting in front of FDA early and often, and really making sure that, because what I really try to not have clients do is, oh, we're just going to do this quick set of testing. We're going to go to this XYZ country, do a few cases, then we're going to do our real testing for FDA. It's like, why would you do it twice? So I think I like to think of it more broadly. Like, let's think of the world as one big place to do the clinical research and involve all of the parties that need to be the best people to bring the product forward. So.
Yeah, I'll just make an editorial comment. I think that the last section of what you spoke to, Lauren, is exactly right. That, you know, coming in and discussing the investigational plan with FDA is always helpful, because even if you decide to go initially outside the United States, that information will feed back. We can provide input. And we also want to understand the motivation to not start, or either concurrently or, you know, start outside. And I guess that gets me back to Vivek, who I know for a fact has many frequent flyer miles, doing studies, great work all over outside the United States. So, Vivek, what goes into your thinking when prospective sponsor of a new device comes to you, and the well-trod path may be to Europe, but there is value, to getting it going here as well. And how do you think about the advice you give back to prospective sponsors?
No, it's a complicated question, Andy. I think the cost probably is the biggest final sort of determinant. Many of the companies, as you just heard from Lauren, don't necessarily have the funding to do all of the I won't say all the testing. It's not like they go outside the U.S. and don't do the testing, but it may not be the same level of rigor, in the sense that I'll give you a very specific example. So if you look, for example, at GLP type testing, GLP testing is always a big issue, and there's some projects I've been involved with where I wouldn't want to do any cases wherever in the world without GLP testing, and there are others where I see it as maybe not as important, let's say. And it's a cost issue, it's a level of complexity issue, and so I can see how sometimes companies will say, you know what, I'm going to get into patients, show that we have something here, so that way they can raise the next series of funding, so that they can do a bigger study and come into the U.S. or do all the additional testing that they need to come into the U.S. So for me, I mean, if a company came to me and they said, what exactly should I do, as they often do, my advice is always do both if you can. But that's usually not what happens. It's usually a funding related decision.
So I think we still need to do a better job of clarifying the need for GLP, maybe the impression that GLP is required to start first in human in the U.S., which per the guidance and our policies is not the case. We certainly want good quality studies, and non-GLP are acceptable, with an explanation of how the study was conducted that may have deviated, but still can be an excellent and acceptable quality without being GLP. But I think that's another message that needs to get out, to the entire ecosystem.
I mean, the other
reimbursement. Go ahead. Sorry, please.
Sorry, I'm just going to make one other aspect to it is actually just time to activation. I mean, I mentioned that before. For a company, as you know, time is money, and for them, waiting an extra 2 or 3 months to do the kind of site activation issues that you need to achieve in the U.S. before getting started, oftentimes you can cut that in half outside the U.S., and that's a significant amount of funding. So, and that's not necessarily an FDA issue. Maybe it's partly, but it's also just the IRB and oftentimes contracting. The hospitals are understandably quite risk averse, and they don't want to take liability for something, particularly if it's a first in human study. So I think that so those kind of negotiations between the company and the hospital can get stretched out. So anything that can be done to, I think that Catherine brought up the idea or I think someone brought up the idea of you need to have this ecosystem where people understand that this is a different type of venture, so to speak. So I think that's going to be important to make this go faster.
Okay. So for Adnan and Vivek, to start with, what is your impression of the appetite for large academic centers to do AFS, knowing the issues involved. We heard a lot about, the reimbursement comes up all the time. That's always a consideration. When you are, doing your cutting edge, you want to do this cutting edge research. What kind of a response do you get from your institutions? I know this is N=2, but what's your impression of the world at large for these kinds of studies? And think about coming out of the pandemic, that where things have needed to be reset.
Well, sure, I'll go first. I think Vivek pointed this out just a few minutes ago as well. You need a physician champion who's really committed to a particular technology. So I think you do need. I think Lauren mentioned this as well. It's a small group of us in the neurovascular space. It's a small community in the U.S. and international. We all know each other, and we get excited rather easily. The whole endovascular realm is taking off pretty much right behind the structural heart and cardiac sort of innovation that's going on. We have a lot of innovation in the neurovascular space. So there are a lot of committed clinicians, both in the U.S. and abroad, who really want to be participants in this sort of revolution which is going on. So I think you've got to start off with the top. So, at our own institution, I didn't just submit a proposal to the IRB. I actually went and met the dean of the medical school and the president of the hospital and said, hey, we really want to do this. And then actually took them the contract and the IRB language that the MDIC group had put together and said, hey, a lot of people have signed on, and then applied peer pressure and saying, hey, look at the list of sites that are already doing this for cardiac. We want to get neuro on board as well. So I think you need to have both those aspects. You need to have local champions, and there aren't a whole lot of them that you need to identify. And then they need to engage their institutions prior to the first protocol arriving. So the table needs to be set prior to the first trial, so that when it shows up, there is some understanding by staff in the sponsored grant department who are going to do the contracts, and the IRB, identify a commercial IRB pathway. For instance, that's what we did here in Buffalo, is that anything that's being regulated by the FDA can be submitted to a commercial IRB. And I think that significantly changed the pathway, because it's kind of hard to find content experts at the level of a local IRB. And there's a lot of hesitancy when you try to put the burden of first-in-man study on a local IRB. I think that is a difficult situation.
So with that, just one quick follow-up for you, Adnan, because the MDIC is with you, and so others are starting to develop a EFS neurovascular site consortium. So your knowledge of the community, this ecosystem you referred to, are those elements in place now, or how much do we need to really build this now, and that it's going to take a while? Where do you think we are in the process?
So on the neurovascular side, I think we are. Again, we have we really have benefited from the work that David Holmes and everybody else has done on the cardiology side. So you've developed best practices, you've created programs, you can demonstrate examples to people who are involved. I think the neurovascular sort of pathway is going to be a little bit faster, and just because we're going to learn from them. The first in human studies are already going on with the neuromodulation side with the FDA. And there's a lot of that is going on right now. Neurovascular, on the other hand, is still traditionally OUS. So
I think there's going to be some hesitancy, and I think it's not going to be from the institutions. I suspect it's going to be more from our corporate partners who have forever planned on going to Brazil or Colombia or Bulgaria to do these first-in-man studies. I think that's where the challenge is going to be.
Yeah, another editorial aside is I think when we first started this process, there was a skepticism, perhaps healthy skepticism, about whether this would work or not, and a wait-and-see approach on the part of many manufacturers until it proved that it had some legs. So the structural heart EFS pathway is now well established, thanks to companies like 4C and these other small companies and large strategics that and Catherine has talked about her experience. But Vivek, there's been a push, or at least within our office of cardiovascular devices, to expand into your particular area of EP. And so what do you think of the prospects? What are the headwinds and tailwinds for EP, more U.S. EP early feasibility studies? You may be on mute. Here we go.
Oh, sorry, I don't know if I did anything. Anyway, hopefully you can hear me now. I was just saying that I've been thinking a lot about this. You and I have talked about this a lot over the years. In some ways, I think the extra complexity of both the device and the patient population in structural heart actually works in favor of the EFS pathway, right? What I mean by that is a lot of the stuff on the electrophysiology side, like catheter ablation devices, for example, identifying the patients is not terribly difficult. Okay, it's relatively easy. So unlike, for example, let's say a particular valve study, for example, where you want a particular pathology and it may be harder to identify those patients. So it may not be that you go to Europe or wherever and you have 10 patients waiting for you. So you don't have that same economies in a more complex pathology than in something like, let's say, AF ablation, where there's patients with AF everywhere. And so you can go to Europe and find 10 patients to treat in one, in 1 week or 1 day or whatever it happens to be. And then on the other side, on the device side, as the devices get more complex, in some ways the companies have to raise more money even to start the development, right? And so it's almost as if they're at a stage where it's not as big of a deal to have the additional funding to start EFS as your first go. Versus on the ablation side, maybe some of the catheters don't require as much to be able to get to a point to do initial studies. So I think there's the nature of the problem may be part of the reason. But as you also know, so if you look at, for example, the implantable devices, electrophysiology, so new defibrillators, et cetera, those do tend to be studied OUS and US almost at the same time. So it's a little bit different there than if you look at catheters, for example. They don't always go through an EFS pathway, but it's not that they're studied OUS before coming to the US. But I guess fundamentally it may be philosophically the EP companies are just not used to doing EFS studies. And it's just starting to happen a little bit at this point with some of the crossover, like with appendage closure that Erin has been involved with, for example, starting an EFS pathway.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to change behaviors when they tend to work, and that's that's human nature. It's not unique to device development, and then it comes down to the value proposition. So, Lauren, just to move it beyond cardiovascular, given your diverse experience now, where do you see opportunities for this type of ecosystem consortia approach to apply tools to get sites sort of interested and sponsors enthusiastic about embracing or at least trying the U.S. process? And do we need to do this sort of in series, walk before we run, or can we actually do many things at the same time? So in other words, is there danger if we go too fast and it actually doesn't work out, and then we're, one step forward, two steps back?
Yeah, I definitely concur with Vivek about the EP community and those types of, catheter-based technologies being kind of maybe not imminently ready for a big push on EFS, just because I don't think it the whole philosophy behind EFS is that you can be iterative, and those technologies, I don't see the iteration in those technologies as much as I see it on the on things in the structural heart space. I do agree that I've seen, and I've been in the neurovascular realm for more than, 20 years. And I've seen a lot of innovation of late, and, with flow diverters, and, for forever, we just had GDC coils and maybe some stents, but now things are really moving and technology is really advancing in the neurospace. I do think that that's a huge opportunity, because I think that there's and that's a space where I think that there's opportunity more on a global perspective, not just because I think that many companies just grew up outside the United States doing their work, and I think now's the time to embrace more of the U.S. Physician partners on the neuro side. I think that heart failure, if there's one niche that I have a lot of clients that are coming up with some very unique and somewhat integrated technologies that use lots of different aspects that for heart failure treatment and diagnosis. I think that that's really, and I'm going to say, I think that there's some education that needs to happen at the FDA side. The structural heart team is phenomenal to work with. Andy, I love the team on structural heart. Not that I don't love the circ support side, but I think that there's some more work to be done there. And then if we go outside of cardiovascular, there's a huge amount of education that needs to happen on EFS with the non-vascular groups at FDA. I've been to several of those divisions bringing EFS forward, and we still need some more outreach. I do think that, just the GLP comment, that's something that I remind the review teams at those divisions that there's not a requirement for GLP by the guidance. So, and hey, I think that that's an opportunity not only for FDA, but also for companies to try and, you can develop your product outside the United States, but someday you want them in the United States. So let's engage with FDA, because it's a partnership that needs to happen sooner rather than later. So.
Yeah, so thanks, Lauren. I appreciate your candid, comments. I take them in good spirit. And this is hard. This is not easy feasibility studies. These are early, and it does take learning. And we have, like all organizations, there are new people. There's training, education on our side, and also on the investigator side, and and also on the sponsor side. So I think this idea about collaboration has been, helpful. I think that's maybe the message we're getting across the conference today. So, Catherine and Lauren, the Breakthrough Devices Program was introduced by FDA. It's been now up and running for a couple of years, and then there was, the MCIT CMS coverage that was going to go live, but it's been pushed forward a little bit till May. Tell us about, when you're thinking about as an individual sponsor, Catherine, and then as an advisor, Lauren, how important is this program to? I always thought of it as synergistic with EFS. If you have an idea, but you need to show some promise, EFS is the on-ramp for that. But so tell us a little bit about your thinking about the Breakthrough Devices Program and its prospects for EFS.
So from my standpoint, I absolutely love the program, and the fact that it's actually will give us 4 years of reimbursement right after FDA approval. It's a really big deal. From a small company standpoint, now if your product is approved as a breakthrough technology product, it's to a certain degree easier for us to raise capital to carry the rest of the clinical work forward. So from my standpoint, it's great. I would challenge the breakthrough designation program just a little bit because I actually don't quite grasp on why there's certain areas that do not have any breakthrough technologies. For example, mitral valve, there's no TMVRs that ever been approved as a breakthrough devices. But conceptually, I absolutely applaud the program, and I appreciate the fact that we will have reimbursement.
Yeah, maybe I'll throw in.
your...
Yeah, I echo Catherine's comment that the breakthrough and the collaboration with CMS giving the NTAP, that's phenomenal. And I think that every investor has latched onto that and made that almost like a predefined requirement for funding, which is unfortunate because the emphasis of breakthrough is, I mean, that's a tailwind, but the headwind for the breakthrough is to come up with an approval trial, a pivotal trial design that isn't rigid in terms of its endpoints of being, long-term, follow-up. And the benefit is that you get it out there and get it reimbursed while you're collecting the rest of the data. So I think we kind of might need to re-emphasize that because I would like to spend more time with FDA on that part of the Breakthrough Technology Program about coming up with appropriate short-term surrogate endpoints that balance the pre-market to post-market ecosystem for use of the product on the market. That's what we really want. And the tailwind of that is, okay, CMS has agreed that during that time frame, there is an ability to get it reimbursed. I think that there's concern from CMS, which is understandable, that there's a lot of products that have been granted the breakthrough designation, and so now it's like I think that that's part of the delay here is how are they going to really deal with that. And I think that that's what I think we need to just balance. So
just sort of follow up to that, do you think there's a potential that all the attention on breakthrough can slow down getting to ID approval because we're negotiating back and forth this designation when we should be spending time on coming to consensus on the non-clinical testing requirements?
The problem is that the poor small company is being told that their VCs are saying, well, we need you to get the breakthrough first so that we can ensure that we will fund you for the IDE. So it's I think we have to have a little bit more communication with the investment community to really get them more comfortable with at least getting through an IDE approval, because it's difficult. And I can appreciate FDA's concern about, well, geez, you want me to give you a breakthrough designation, but I don't even know that you're going to do an IDE, and can we talk about what the product is and how we test the product? Right. So I see both sides of the fence here, and I think that we got to have a process of coming to the middle on this, because we've been masked with what the intent of the breakthrough is. And maybe there's something to learn from the drug side, because it exists on the drug side.
Yeah, I think a designation is great. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to be declared breakthrough, but first patient in is really where we need to get, and that means ID approval. So I think, yeah, I agree. Sounds like more work is needed there. We are running at the end of our time here, and so predictions are difficult to make, particularly about the future. With that, 5 years from now, are we still going to be having meetings like this, ironing out the challenges of U.S. EFS, or are we going to make so much progress that this would just be a given? We can just run through. We could start with Adnan and run through the panel. What your 2-sentence prediction would be?
I think we are going to see a real shift, particularly in neurovascular technologies, but also in neuromodulation, brain-machine interface, where the U.S. is going to be leading the charge. I think while other places are innovating as well, I think the activity level on the sponsor side is quite exceptional in the U.S. And the creation of this early feasibility pathway, and by the way, I just sort of agree with Lauren there that I'm not quite sure I understand exactly the relationship between breakthrough and EFS and whether it's helpful and hurtful. So maybe, Andy, you could maybe clarify that a little bit. But I think 5 years from now, we would have a robust early feasibility program in the entire neuro space, device space. And you'd be looking for other markets and other specialties to bring them on.
Great. Vivek?
I'm not as optimistic as Adnan, I guess, in this, at least in our field. And I think the reason is it's money, right? I mean, in my mind, money is still a funding issue, and it's cheaper to go outside the U.S. for lots of reasons than to do EFS. So I think that people will continue to strive toward EFS as best they can, but they'll continue to utilize OUS opportunities when they can. I think that if you want to foster this more, Andy, I think that there are things that the FDA can do, both in terms of carrots, such as I think you said it, or you mentioned, for example, does EFS lead to automatic breakthrough, or et cetera. So there are probably things like that could be, these carrots could be dangled that might push a company past the activation energy that's required. But there are also things outside your control, largely related to the process of IRB approval, contracts, and all these other things. That to get past that, I think you need to do, well, what you're doing, which is to try to establish an ecosystem that goes beyond just the FDA and companies, but also brings in the institutions in various aspects and tries to establish. And perhaps you do this, you identify a couple of institutions and say, this is where you have expedited sort of pathways. And I don't know what the fairest, most effective way is to do this, but without doing something like that, the financial aspect of this is just really a difficult hurdle to make additional changes, I think.
Catherine?
So I actually think that one of the limiting factor, and hopefully in 5 years it's not going to be there, is the fact that I believe every EFS have to have CMS reimbursement. So there got to be a reimbursement for category A experimental. It's only up to 15 patients. If FDA could find a way to work with small, large industries and academia to figure it out and streamline regulatory requirements, there gotta be a way how we can cover it just for such a small number of patients to complete the initiatives that FDA started and have all of the first-in-human studies done in the United States. That is easier for U.S. manufacturers as well, and really great for our academia community. But I'm hoping that's going to happen within the next year and not 5 years, but it's a wishful thinking.
Okay.
And, I'm a very aspirational person. I always think about future. And I believe in 5 years, hopefully we will be in a similar settings, but talking maybe how we can streamline the pivotal study design, because EFS will be very well-oiled machines that will extend to other areas. And now we will work with FDA to figure it out a streamlined way of doing relatively small pivotal trials, but maybe talking about something more substantial on a post-market registry to really study the product in the real-world settings.
Lauren, close us out.
Yeah, I think in 5 years we'll be talking about the struggles we're having in other disciplines. I think structural heart will be a well-oiled machine, and we're going to be talking about, I think, neuro, and I think heart failure. And I kind of am in Vivek's camp that EP is a tougher get in for EFS. So.
Good. Well, I wanted to thank all four of you for what I found to be a very interesting session. I hope it was to the viewers. And why don't we wrap up here and turn it back to Aaron. Thanks.
Well, welcome back, everyone. We have Andy Farb here. I'd like to welcome him to this aspect of our symposium. He's no stranger, literally, to the audience, since he just moderated that session, which went very well. We're going to focus this interview on Andy's perspective from being the Chief Medical Officer in the Cardiovascular Device Division at CDRH, and someone who's really championed EFS as one of the authors on the guidance that was published back in October 2013, which has been referred to a number of times in this meeting. To get started, Andy, help us understand from a perspective of someone not at FDA, the differences that review teams have to, or the different perspectives that a review team has to approach an IDE within the EFS context versus an IDE within a, let's say, a pivotal PMA context.
So thanks, Aaron. It's great to share some thoughts about the EFS program. I think when we first envisioned it, we recognized that we had to relearn some of our evaluation strategies that we had not done for quite some time. And that is because we are much more used to evaluating much more mature technologies that had been evaluated elsewhere in larger studies before coming to the United States. So we had to, again, recognize the device development process, and that is starting from prototyping, non-clinical evaluation, all those steps that needed to be understood before we got to enough information to justify going into humans. And so this was the idea of tailoring the non-clinical evaluation to the stage of device development, that it really didn't make sense anymore to do a full characterization of a device, which in many cases, or maybe in most cases, would be modified as we learned how it worked, whether it actually fulfilled its proof of principle, was generally safe, and that it was really ready to go to a next larger study. And for that, we had to then think a little bit more flexibly about the type of non-clinical evaluation that we could accept, and then move forward to a first-in-human study.
And you advise a lot of review teams, and also you informally advise a lot of startups. What is the key advice you could give both of them when they're looking at EFS, and couple that with what is the most common mistake you see made? You can keep the mistakes focused on the sponsors, because we know none of them are made at FDA.
That's right. Yes, it's all on the other side. We're hardly ever, we'll never admit to them. But what the most important thing is this interactive process that I think we built into the program, and that is the understanding that particularly when we're dealing with novel technologies or novel uses of approved technologies, there are more unknowns, and then have those on the table. That it can be discussed between sponsor and review team to recognize where the gaps are particularly in the non-clinical evaluation, to be addressed with further study, or if on the bench or in animal studies, or if not, then if we're going to go into humans, why is that justified? What risk mitigation we can build in, and have that dialogue. And I think that's where the program has succeeded, because when you bring the regulators in on the first floor, they buy into and understand what the sponsor is trying to do. They have a better understanding of the device and the device development program, and then can adjust their thinking or continue to support the program if things are going well, to move from first in human up this clinical study chain. So it's the interaction, I think, that's has worked the best. And the mistake, I think, would be the lack thereof, that where sponsors perhaps move too quickly, they are somewhat concerned that they might get a negative response for FDA and not start the dialogue.
So the idea is like, oh, we don't want to tell FDA about this because we want to work it out ourselves and give a little time, and then maybe not have FDA bought into the process you've used to wrestle a specific problem to the ground.
Right, or that that FDA would somewhat be punitive. That understanding that in the first uses of devices, and particularly in situations where there might be high risk individuals, that things might not go as planned. Mm-hmm. But sharing that information up front, we look at that as risk mitigation, the early reporting and the frequent interactions to let the review team know what's going on, to help. Okay, well, this is what we've learned. This is what we're going to adjust in terms of our patient selection, perhaps in terms of our device modification. We learned that we need a more flexible device, that we should avoid this particular anatomy, and it should be that kind of an interaction that will go from the first 5 patients to the next 20 patients when we have that information.
One of the premises of EFS was that this kind of working together early on facilitated a collaborative dynamic that then would translate into a smoother IDE process to support PMAs and pivotal trials. Is that naive, or do you believe that's real?
Well, I always thought that the way we approached the thinking was foundational and vertically directed, such that, the idea that we started with this just-in-time testing, do the testing you need now to support moving forward to that next stage. Then you might continue to do non-clinical or animal studies to justify going to the pivotal stage. And why wouldn't that thinking apply to a pivotal trial? Or to or in between trial. So those principles really do apply. And I was quite surprised of the number of EFS that can move through the first small subset of patients to a very slightly larger subset right to a pivotal trial without going through an intermediate phase. And that's been facilitated, I think, by having the interactions early. Once we learn about how the device is working, we can start talking about what the pivotal trial might look like, and get that going almost in a modular fashion. At the same time, we're seeing more patients getting more experience and getting more sites up and running. Let's start thinking about the pivotal trial now, instead of waiting to the end.
One of the premises of this meeting is taking the learnings from cardiovascular elsewhere. How is that going, and how, from an FDA perspective, do you share these learnings, and how can the community facilitate that process?
So internally at FDA, we have, I share the leadership with Maureen Dreher, who is the co-leader of the EFS program. We meet monthly with the EFS reps and to go over cross-cutting issues and questions. But this is going to take more than just FDA, as you know. And this is part of the collaborative approach that we've started and gone furthest with cardiovascular devices with the Cardiovascular EFS Consortium. And so what we've learned is that for that to move forward, we need the buy-in from clinical leaders and the industry to embrace the program. And, I think there was skepticism that we could have pulled this off when the program was developed and rolled out. And now that I think we have a foothold and have had some success, are hopeful that now the EFS idea amongst industry and investigators will move horizontally to other areas. So the next target that you've heard about is particularly focused on neurovascular. And then we chose that because we've already seen a good deal of EFS activity in the neuro devices, but many have been sponsor investigators, and that's fine. But we'd like to get the industry more incentivized and to use that program. And we're asking, some changes of behavior to test drive it and see if the value added with doing some of these studies in the U.S.
Great. So fast forward 3 or 4 years from now at future meetings focused on EFS, where do you think the kind of choke points will be at that time? Right now, I think a lot of the focus is on, the negotiation around trials between sponsor and sites. And how do you think things are going to change moving forward, and where's the next spot we need to be focusing on?
So aspirationally, I would love to have that we wouldn't need to have an EFS sessions anymore, because it would just be assumed the smooth sailing, we just, all the problems have been solved and we're it's, boring at that point, but not yet. But we still have work to do internally. There's it's not as if we've solved everything within FDA. We still have to train staff. We still have to think about these type of reviews are not for everyone. We need reviewers who see the big picture, understand the clinical risk and benefits, and really want to facilitate these new device technologies moving forward. And then outwardly, we have the issues of coverage. That's still a challenge, reimbursement, and then all the extra regulatory aspects of the budget negotiations, the site startup. IRBs, I think, were perceived as somewhat of a holdup, but I think that's a fixable, or if then there are issues, I think that's addressable. We haven't heard too much about that. I think we're willing and able to answer questions and educate sometimes so that folks understand what our letters mean for EFS. But there are those other ecosystem factors still need work. And I think that's where we sit at the table, but we sit amongst collaborators, the way I feel about it, to move it forward.
Well, I think with that, our time is running down, but I think that really a subtext of this meeting is really to acknowledge the leadership that you and your colleagues at CDARH have provided. And really, it's a different dynamic where everyone else is trying to keep up with FDA and to really bolster the leadership to reciprocate the leadership that you guys have provided. So thanks for your efforts, and thanks for spending the time this afternoon.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, Aaron. Great. I think we have a really nice session here to cap off what has been a wonderful symposium. With respect to this session, we have some great panel members, which I'll introduce in a moment. But what we'll really do over the next 20, 30 minutes is discuss. Really, if you look at all we've seen over the last 7 or 8 years with respect to the EFS program, it's really allowed innovation in the medtech sector to get into the US and allow that to get companies on a pathway to approval much faster and more efficiently, than in the past. However, at the same time, over those 7 or 8 years in Europe, the clinical access has really become more restrictive, especially with the emergence of the MDR and now the actual initiation of the MDR. So what we'd like to do is discuss that this afternoon and how that's really impacting clinical, regulatory, and funding policies for companies both based in the United States and in Europe. And before I get to introductions, I think there's a polling question that we'd like to bring up. Great, thank you. So everyone, as a sponsor, what is the biggest barrier to performing an early feasibility study in Europe? If you had to choose from these 3, would it be regulatory hurdles? Would it be resource dilution? For example, if you're a US company, all that it would take to ship a team over to Europe to perform those studies, or study reimbursement. And it looks like we're getting the answers pretty quick. There we go. All right. While we're waiting for that to compile, I would like to just introduce the folks that are going to be on the panel. First, we're going to start off with Olivier Delporte, who's the president and CEO of Miracor, which is an emerging technology company based in Europe and who's seen a lot of this stuff firsthand. They have a wonderful system that they're using to try and treat symptoms of heart failure. And then we'll move on to Daniel O'Mahony, who's a partner at Soroba Life Sciences, one of the leading VC or venture capital groups over in Europe. We have Hanson Gifford of the Foundry and Lightstone Ventures, both 2 groups that have really been leaders in both the foundation of important clinical and device advancements and also the funding of those advancements. And then Lisa Becker, who's an executive at Abbott, which everyone knows is one of the largest medtech companies in cardiovascular and I think in overall. And then we'll cap it off with Nitin Mehta from TOV Sud, who's an executive at one of the largest notified bodies in Europe. So are we ready for the results? Let's see here. Great. Looks like regulatory hurdles, 48%. Resource dilution, fairly close second, 36%. And then study reimbursement or lack thereof. Thank you. So with that, let's move on to first question. Olivier, you're currently the leader of a private venture-backed company in Europe, and you're working in the heart failure space. How has the MDR and really the concurrent presence of the EFS in the United States, how's that impacted your clinical and regulatory strategy? And what impact do you think the MDR has had in general on medtech innovation in Europe?
Thank you, Rick. So yeah, I'm at Miracor since 5 years now, and indeed we have a Pixel system that's used in primary PCI for STEMI patients. Actually, the MDR and the EFS have had some but limited impact on Miracor because fortunately for the company, there was clinical data coming from Europe already early on. And there had been, a company had clinical data coming then and got CE mark of a 2nd generation system last year under the MDD. It also received breakthrough designation in 2019 from the FDA. To be specific on the EFS, there had been some discussions with the agency about an EFS, but it was actually to use the product a little bit differently than how it had been used in Europe in the early studies. The results from Europe were actually positive, which led to the discussion to stick to the way the product was used. And actually, as we speak, we're in advanced discussions with the agency to get approval for an ID trial. The MDR on its side has had impact even in the last few years in two ways. One, because the notified bodies have been slow and unpredictable. And actually it's a sign of them having been extremely busy, at least that was the perception from the company side, extremely busy with getting MDR certified and adapting. So it's been very difficult to get predictability, to get ideas on timing. And then the other element that we've seen, even though we were reviewed under MDD in the last years, and we got CE mark last year, is that year after year, the requirements were becoming stricter, even though we were not yet in the MDR era. So that was for Miracore specifically. In terms of impact on medtech in Europe, so I'm neutral. I was born in the States, worked mostly for US companies, but now work for a European company, and I'm European. I would say it's a negative for Europe and it's a positive for the US, especially when combined with programs like the breakthrough designation and the MCIT on the funding side, which don't really exist in Europe. And, everyone knows Europe was historically a little bit easier from a regulatory standpoint, but has always been difficult on the reimbursement side, and it's very fragmented. And now with the MDR, Europe is basically becoming difficult regulatory-wise, and it's still difficult reimbursement-wise. So I think on a global base, it deprioritizes Europe, obviously, to the US, which it has always been. I mean, the US is the largest market in the world, but also to regions like China, number 2 market, like Japan, which, as we heard earlier, has become very predictable. Because concretely, what we see is that the MDR has brought a lack of clarity and a lack of predictability in the regulatory process. At least that's the perception from companies. And that's one aspect. The other one is that there is a major bottleneck. I think as we speak, I heard last week that there were 19 or 20 MDR approved notified bodies, while there were 75 to 80, MDD approved notified bodies a few years ago. And so some companies do not find a notified body today, or struggle because it doesn't work with the one they have. So I think the impact is real on Europe. And today I'd say to a company looking at a therapy that's got global potential, I would say if you can afford it, because we heard about cost, the US is costly. If you can afford it, start with the EFS and then go through the US pathway and leverage the clinical data between US and Europe to get European approval. So that's my answer to the question, Rick.
Thank you. Olivier, do you have any concern, for example, we often see with Israeli-based companies, for example, an area of really strong innovation, that once they've gotten, we don't even really that far along, a lot of times sometimes they'll develop the full product over in Israel, but sometimes they'll really establish a team in the United States. And that's partly because the time zones are so far apart, but also because the need to have a full presence over in the United States. And would you say that the environment right now, would it create that type of environment for folks in Europe who have new ideas and are trying to create a new company or maybe have an early stage product?
I think you need US presence. MedTech today, if you have a global therapy, it starts with the US. Israel has been great for innovation, but I think the market where the product has to get to is the US. And I often say, even for Miracore, the value of the company is in the US. So whether it's European companies, Israeli companies, you need to incorporate the US and the agency, the FDA, in the thinking from the get-go. And unfortunately for Europe and Israel, to some extent, I think Europe and that part of the world has gone further in the list now, because you look at China and there are companies that talked earlier which are active in China, where things are happening as well, and the markets warrant an earlier start than Europe, given the current environment as we see.
Absolutely. Hey, thanks, Olivier. Great answer. Really appreciate it. Daniel, so from your perspective, as partner at a leading venture capital firm over in Europe, how has the new MDR impacted the way you look at deal flow, how you view deals, as either fundable or not fundable? What are the key aspects, that you're looking for now in diligence? And is that different from what you were, looking for perhaps 5 years ago?
So thanks, Rick. I'll give an example. 10 years ago, we invested in a technology which was spun out of Emory University into a new startup company. We relocated the startup to Galway, Ireland. It very much focused on the European clinical development pathway. If we were spinning that technology out of Emory University today, we would encourage the company to focus on the US clinical development pathway because of MDR. I think with MDR, the landscape is more onerous today. It has created a huge amount of uncertainty for companies, for entrepreneurs, for investors, and so forth. And as a consequence of that, we just find it more difficult to plan for a good clinical development pathway in Europe today. As Olivia has said, with the reduction in the number of notified bodies, the demand on the available notified bodies today has obviously increased substantially. There's a lot of legacy devices which need recertification, which adds to demand. And because of the requirement for external review post a clinical trial, there's, I suppose, a lack of clarity in terms of how that might impact on review process in order to secure approval later on. And I think for the notified bodies, they don't necessarily have the expertise required to cater for some of the small medtech companies developing new innovative products. And it's more difficult for an early stage company perhaps to get the same airtime with a notified body as opposed to maybe some of the more established medical device companies. So for us today, for a company pursuing a clinical development pathway, we would very much encourage them to focus on a US clinical pathway. We recognize the size of a PMA trial may be larger, but I think there is more certainty. Our experience dealing with the FDA from our entrepreneurs, it's a pleasure to deal with the FDA. They're very collaborative, they're very embracing, they're very encouraging, and that's all very good for companies going through a clinical development pathway. So, 10 years ago, I would have given you a different answer to what our position would be today. In terms of feasibility studies, I think it's different. I think, as with a pivotal trial, you want to go to the best centers in the world to do your studies at the end of the day. I think the problem with Europe is really not well positioned. It's not harmonized for early feasibility studies. And what I mean, we're a collection of 32 countries. Every feasibility study requires you going through both ethics and competent authorities in each and every country. If you're splitting your feasibility study across 2 or 3 countries, it's 2 or 3 competent authorities. It's a number of ethics committees. Different competent authorities have different requirements. They may require different endpoints, different inclusion, exclusion. So there's a lot of reiteration of the protocol to get harmonization across maybe 2 or 3 different countries, if that's your approach to do an early feasibility study or a first-in-man study. So it does add cost and time and delay, and I suppose a degree of frustration. I think we mentioned cost in the earlier panels. It's probably cheaper, certainly, to do those early feasibility studies or first-in-human studies in Europe. And at the end of the day, I think you want to be working with the best clinicians, and you want to be working with centers who also have very, very good study coordinators, because at the end of the day, you want to ensure no protocol deviations, good follow-up, capturing patient data, and so forth. But for a pivotal trial, we would very much encourage companies to focus on an FDA pathway. And I suppose the other aspect to it, the strategics have a preference for FDA-approved products, for early product commercialization in the USA. So I think there's greater value to be got at the end of those types of journeys when you're in discussion with strategics on an M&A where you have FDA approval and early product commercialization in the US as well.
Effective. Hansen, as someone who's been involved in both the foundation and the financing of multiple early stage companies, what kind of guidance have you been now, giving to your companies with respect to the clinical and regulatory strategy, given the context that we're speaking about here with the emergence of the MDR and the presence of the EFS?
I think this is a really important topic. I'm glad we're having the discussion. I think the principles for any startup remain the same, since forever. And that is, first of all, that the quality of data is paramount.
There's nothing worse than running a trial, getting half-baked data that doesn't give you the answers you need, and having to run it over again. So working with the best possible clinicians, the best possible centers is principle number one. And then speed is next. Startups have limited resources, and when you're building a house or something, there's the fast, good, cheap trade-off, pick any two. Well, you can't pick slow and cheap in medical device development because you've got a team sitting there burning cash every day. So speed is of the essence here. And so with those principles in mind, you go out and look, and you should keep several options open. You shouldn't say, oh, we're going to do our first in man in this country, because things happen, whether it's changes to regulations, issues with the regulatory bodies, or COVID, or who knows what. So have several options going forward. And so startups are constantly comparing different countries, different sites, who is most likely to provide really high quality data in a predictable, relatively quick format. And if the two different sites are equally high quality, equally likely to enroll, then you go for the centers that are in the more important market. And for the medical device world, that typically means the US. And so I would echo all of Vivek Reddy's comments in the prior comment about as devices get more complex, more important, these structural heart type projects, being able to do those EFS studies in the US really is of high value and the best option if possible. And so the work that Andrew Farb and others have done to make the EFS pathway work are really essential. One last comment I would make is that I don't think it's been discussed yet, is that the MDR is one more reason that startups need really bulletproof quality systems from the start. Having to go back and redo that gets harder and harder, and the FDA requires a rigorous system, but under MDR, an even more rigorous company-wide quality system is going to be needed as well. And so all of that work up front is a big investment, but it's essential.
That's great. Thank you. Lisa, as an executive at Abbott, who's a company that's had really done a great job over the last 15, 20 years executing some very challenging clinical trials and doing them well. And I'm thinking of MitraClip in particular. How do you look at this environment now? How do you look at this landscape? Large companies are always kind of looking at, they have a certain amount of cash and they're going to invest it in certain areas. Certainly you have programs that need to be supported clinically, but how does this landscape change things for you, or how has it changed things, say now versus 5 or 10 years ago?
Thanks, Rick. That's a great question. Personally, having done medical device regulatory work for quite some time, my traditional answer to your question would be easy. We'd always go to the EU. At least for the past 2 decades, our regulatory and clinical strategy for getting products to clinicians and then ultimately to market has been to start internationally, most often in Europe, where major geography commercialization was most always first through CE marking. I think when we look at the MDR today, we can't, it's huge. There hasn't been anything this big happen in a long time in the regulatory space. I mean, when I think probably Japan introducing their whole new structure back in 2005, and that was quite some time ago. So with MDR, as we look at it from regulatory, we're looking at added, I guess, motivation and a real potential for an about face and how we look at clinical regulatory strategies. Where do you go first? Gosh, with new technologies, it's really important where you set your strategy. Right now, I would say timing's everything. The EU MDR is increasing clinical requirements for high-risk medical devices. timelines for CE marking already are increased, and even more so with MDR. If you include clinical scrutiny, the timelines for MDR, I'll say MDR approvals or CE marking, are looking to exceed possibly significantly even the standard review times in the US. And I think as we're talking about clinical studies, we can't forget that that all bleeds into the regulatory approvals, and that's really the ultimate goal. So if you look at the CE mark, actually it was a great point to add in the quality systems, because I think that's a huge piece that can't be overlooked as well. CE marking is just going to be more difficult. At this time, you have that more difficult, and the FDA expedited review programs to include EFS, and we talked a little bit earlier about breakthrough as well, have provided pathways in the US for smoother early clinical experience, as well as timely review for your ultimate product approval. I think, well, at least my experience in structural heart, it's shown getting your product looked at by FDA early does have a lot of benefit in the entire cycle of regulatory reviews. So something else that I think we haven't talked about today is getting your product there, getting them looking at it, talking about it, interaction with, I'm fortunate to be on the structural heart side with FDA, and it's been fantastic as far as getting inputs and feedback. And I think as we go forward, and Nitin will probably talk about this a little bit too, you can't get a lot of that from your notified body anymore. We used to be able to do clinical expert opinion meetings. You can't do that anymore. So I think there are some hidden benefits when I at least look from the regulatory perspective. Back to your question, you asked about where do we invest our cash to support the clinical trials. I'm talking a lot about more than the clinical trial is really getting your product to market and getting commercialization. We look at that whole life cycle to get to approval. So the potential for clinical device reimbursement in the US, it adds to the attractiveness of EFS here. I think even as we look at a smaller EFS of 15 to get you into a larger, maybe 30 to 45 patient EFS, there's still device reimbursement. And especially when you've got an expensive device, you don't get devices reimbursed over in Europe. And of course, the EFS ultimately feeds into the pivotal clinical trial development and the investment into the US clinicals. And I think generally, if you combine potential for reimbursement for your investigational device to the potential for speedier overarching regulatory approval for market entry in the United States, we're really looking at a significant shift in where manufacturers will focus, if not first to the US, at least maybe at the same time as Europe. So my opinion, the paradigm of automatically going internationally first is being challenged for sure. I think we're going to see a real significant shift, especially for larger companies.
Thanks, Lisa. And just a quick follow-up. You mentioned the 15 patient EFS that becomes 30 and 45, and we've seen that as well. We did that in my last company. Start with 15, and then you get an extension to 30, and then another 15, you get to 45, right, or you get to 60. Have you been able to actually take that and dovetail that into your CE mark cohort, or do you view them as separate? Because for that's
I think
a deal for a small company. Question is, do you guys ever look at it that way?
Yeah, and I would say that probably a little bit different when we talk about dovetailing versus poolability. I'm certainly not the clinical expert on that with the biostatistics, but we have been more successful, I'll use the word dovetailing, into our CE cohort as opposed to rolling that into being a poolable part of the pivotal trial. It is used usually as something you can refer to or additive, but not necessarily as part of the decision.
Nitin, as an executive at one of the largest, you are the largest, I'm not sure, notified body in Europe, give us your perspective. How's the MDR? what kind of pressure has it placed on notified bodies? We've all heard about, the limited bandwidth that notified bodies have. How true is that? Is that something maybe that was true a year ago and less true now? Where are we on that continuum? As you know, their companies, look, the bottom line is we all want to bring our products both to the United States and to Europe. And we'd love to understand, what the best way is to access, get clinical access in Europe and get on the regulatory path to approval, obviously. So if you could just give us your perspective on that and give us kind of a state of the state, I think that'd be super helpful.
Sure. Thank you, Rick. No, it's been, I've been at TUV for about 6 years now, and it's been quite a ride, and going through the experience, this magnanimous shift from MDD to MDRs. First, there's the long list of clients who want to get through MDD, visibly so, because the requirements under MDR are way more stringent than they were. But it takes us back to where Europe was a few years ago, and when PIPS scandal and all that stuff happened. That forced us to look at the clinical requirements where they were, and hence, the reality 10 years ago that it was easier to get into Europe than the US, and then the increased measures in terms of transparency and all the initiatives at FDA are now showing the results. Whereas Europe being so wide and diverse, things have, they're still getting to MDRs, which has made things harder. So workload has been hard, and there have been increases in the capacity as well as the number of clients. From our side of at TUV, fortunately we started early, and hence the early adopters, and if you're a big player in the notified body scheme of things, you have resources who are trained. One of the big requirements from MDRs was the requirements placed on its technical reviewers as well as the clinical reviewers in general. So we've seen a lot of the small notified bodies, that have not been designated yet, and the number of notified bodies which are designated has shrunk to a few. So definitely that has contributed to the bigger players on the notified body side of things getting more clients than that was expected. So we've been fortunate to have kept with the pace of the growth and the supply and demand, but it's a slow process to catch up and sustain. And again, I think focusing on Europe in general now with ISO 14155, we're now starting to talk about the early feasibility stuff, which has been the topic of discussion today. So workload, yes, has been a lot. And under MDRs, we are, again, still in the ramp-up phase, and learning and collaboration is the key. Bigger notified bodies, yes, working with bigger clients versus smaller clients. Coming from a heart valve manufacturer myself, it's very evident for us to understand, and we believe that innovation happens with smaller companies in addition to bigger companies as well. So if we don't involve them and don't proactively adjust our systems to foster innovation, then that's a patient population that we are failing to serve. So in addition to the regulatory environment being in a state of transition, we've also tried to focus on bringing value to clients. And yes, the workload has been quite a bit, but at the same time, since we started early, as everyone said, it depends on the timing of when you start to prepare. So we've added resources at the right places. We've trained resources. Now the challenge is to stabilize as MDRs, which are a thick copy, versus MDD, to move towards more stability and more clarity, and everyone learns together. I think a fundamental understanding when you're on the regulator side of things is to start with the mentality that you don't know everything. You have to sit and understand a device and collaborate with the manufacturers before you can comment on them. And then now the second variable that's facing us is managing our learning. So everyone is learning together. So it's we've picked up phone calls from all clients of all sizes, and I think it's definitely been tough, but collaboration and communication can never be enough. Is our mantra. Yeah.
Thank you. Couple of follow-up questions. One, have you seen the mix between class 2 and class 3 devices change? Given the MDR, it seems that class 3 devices may have more barriers now. They obviously do, but more barriers relative to class 2s. In other words, the MDR may have affected class 3 devices more than class 2. I'm curious about that. Have you seen the mix change at all, or has it been the same?
It depends on the type of technology we're looking at. There's also been cases where devices were up-classified. So in those cases, class 2s were now they are classified as class 3. So there definitely the scrutiny has increased. In terms of the focus on quality system becoming more complex with an emphasis on risk, which was in parallel with the requirements of 13485. So that system had to evolve and come in line with the rest of the documents. So there's a lot of, in Europe, there's a lot of guidance documents knowing how diverse it is. So there have been efforts in terms of making things consistent. So we do see, coming to your question, yes, class 2A devices may have increased scrutiny, yes. Yes.
Finally, for class, when we're looking at class 2 and class 3, like devices actually as a whole, and we're looking at US data and bringing US data into an application, do you look at, do you see the need you have to have a certain amount of European data in a cohort, in other words, to be considered? Can it be 100% US data? Does it need to be half and half? I know there isn't like a set rule, but what's your general view on the use of US data relative to a CE mark application?
Definitely. That's a very good question that comes forth every now and then. Is data generated outside Europe, is that relevant and applicable in support of a CE marking application? Yes, companies do collect data elsewhere, and then they come to Europe, and it depends on it's a very specific clinical conversation at that point in time, which then again underscores the need for greater collaboration at step 1. We've been in those situations where because there is no clear-cut guidance in terms of early exploration and feasibility studies, by the time we get to CE mark, if we don't have the data of what the path that got a company to that point for commercialization, and issues have not been addressed throughout the investigation, by that time it's too late to address aspects. So since the market is moving towards allowing exploration, which the US market is focusing on, then being available to discuss what other data sources are available is very beneficial for everyone in the mix at the end of the day for the patients. And early involvement is important. So we do, again, I think it's important that the technical experts are indeed talking to the clinicians at step 1. So in terms of initiatives that we try to foster are greater collaboration at step 1, have project kickoff meetings, pick up the phone. Requirements are new. Everyone is understanding and learning. So a phone call is worth more than 1,000 words in an email. And it's helped. We've been fortunate to help many startups in the recent past as well, even in this chaotic time, so to speak. Yeah.
Thank you, Needham. Great answers. I really appreciate those. I think we're ready to wrap up now. And I guess in summary, I think what we've heard here is that the environment really has changed with the emergence of the MDR and a more restrictive environment. Things have changed, but it doesn't mean that the notified bodies are closed for business. They're clearly open. They've clearly had some challenges with the, transitioning to the MDR, had to scale up, had to hire resources, but they're around and available and want to do business with you and want to help you bring your device to Europe. But that being said, there's been some clear shift in strategies, towards the United States, given the emergence of the EFS program. And I think really what that has shown is how important the emergence of the EFS program has been. In particular, I think over the last five years or so, because there was this kind of transition time now. Things are starting to get a little more efficient in Europe, but things were really chaotic for a period of time there. And with that, a company like mine, I know that the company I ran a few years ago, I don't think we would have existed or been able to maintain our existence if the EFS program wasn't there, and given the chaos that was happening in Europe, which is now smoothing out. So really kudos to the FDA for the establishment of this program. It's been a lifesaver for the industry. It's created incredible value for patients by giving patients access much earlier in the United States, but actually, if you think about it globally, because it's given companies a chance to really get in to great, clinical sites, collect really good clinical data much earlier. And that has a strong impact on the learning curve, not only for the regulatory bodies, but for the companies themselves. So with that, I'd like to wrap this up. Thank you so much, everyone, for your wonderful answers, and I'll turn it back over to Aaron.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to wrap this up. Thanks to Aaron, and thanks to his staff, thanks to the faculty, and thanks to all the participants for being involved with this. This meeting has been a journey that had a prodrome. In medicine, we are familiar with the term a prodrome. It means that something is happening, that we see something that could be happening that could be a major problem, and we try to take care of it before it becomes more of a problem. The prodrome of this journey that we've been talking about included the fact that there were patients with unmet clinical needs in this country, and there were investors and investigators and institutions and medical device companies who helped design devices aimed at treating these patients. And then we saw all the testing and the treating going outside of this country. And so Jeff Popma talked about the fact that the core valve was then completely studied in Europe, and then we had to bring European people back to train us how to do the core valve, which had been headquartered here. So with this prodrome that we have had, as we know, beginning with Jeff Sherin and Andy Farb and Bram Zuckerman in 2013, they came up with the classic guidance document, which has set the stage, and then the journey then picked up. What have we learned about this journey over the past few hours? We've learned many things. We've learned about some of the stakeholders involved. We've learned about some of the sites. We've learned about professional societies. We've learned about the regulatory bodies. We've learned about patients and IRBs, and all of the professional societies are involved, as well as the institutions. There have been several groups of learnings. Think about that. There have been several groups of learnings. We've learned about characteristics, number one. We've learned about steps, number two. And we have learned about processes. Let's talk about characteristics. Throughout, we have heard key words and key concepts that relate to sites, that relate to companies, that relate to investigators, and relate to the regulatory agencies. What are some of those key characteristics? Well, they would be collaboration, they would be communication, they would be partnershiping, they would be patience with an IENCE, as well as passion and learning and reinventing. We will remember that Ian Meredith gave us his multiple different P adjectives. All of the things that he has talked about in the past, it is embodied in those things that succeed, those things that move forward. We could only hope that each of us as individuals learn to embody those P characteristics. We can certainly hope that our kids embody them. We can hope our institutions embody them. We hope our society embodies them. And so we've learned about key concepts and key words that are incredibly important that go across all of the different stakeholders. So that's the first set of things that we have learned. The second set of things that we learned were the key steps. And Jeff Popma had incredibly interesting steps. There were 3 of them, and I've added a 4th to it. The first key step is the product ready? Is it deliverable? Is it efficient? As we take the step from idea to first in man, to early feasibility studies, to pivotal studies, and then to the big world. That's the first step. The second step are the techniques used by the performers. Techniques used by the performers, are they ready? Or are we still trying to decide what to do with A and B, how to make it work, how to make it fit together? Those procedural performance things have to be ready. The third one, do we have the educational platforms set in place to train new people, to train our nursing people, our hospital staff, to train the performing physicians, to train the physicians who are following these patients? Have we the resources so that we can educate them what will be needed to optimize the care of their specific patients with this technology aimed at addressing unmet clinical needs? And the 4th step is how then and how important is and how can we do improved communications with FDA? It's pretty straightforward. You pick up the phone or whatever it is we use now for communication these days and talk to them. And talk to them early and talk to them often whenever there are issues and have them be integrally involved. And then we talked about the strategies. So we've talked about key characteristics. We've talked about key steps. We've talked about then strategies for success. And that then, as Adnan has mentioned, and everybody else has mentioned, has been the development of an ecosystem. You are part of an ecosystem. All of our stakeholders need to be part of that ecosystem as we continue to learn what we're doing and how to do it better. And we can only learn that together. This is not a one-size-fits-all. It's certainly not a one-person-fits-all, and not a one institution-fits-all, and not a one medical device company fits all. We have to be in this together, not only in the United States, but we need to then expand and include our colleagues from around the world, like we have done in Japan, and we should be engaging Europe and other countries about that. So we've been about a journey this afternoon, an amazing journey, like a river. The journey gets broader and deeper and wider and faster and more encompassing as it starts from on high and then rushes down to the ocean or wherever it is going. So we've developed along the way with this river that we're on, we've developed important tools to help us. MDIC has wonderful tools that we can roll into our practices. We have developed strategies with the EFS strategies, working with all of the different stakeholders. Along the way, we have embraced partners, and that will be broader and broader. It was never the intent for the structural EFS program to just be structural. We said, we'll start someplace. It's a good place to start, the structural, but then we're going to explore, we're going to expand and bring into the big tent, neurovascular, electrophysiology, in the future, GI, in the future orthopedics. All of those disciplines are involved in EFS studies. We need to bring those learnings that we have learned so that we can help them optimize their own field. So it's never meant to be inclusive. It has always been expansive. It's a great word, expansive. As we move along, we will continue to gather strength. We will continue to gather apostles that bring the message wherever they go, wherever they work, whoever they treat, because that then fills out the goal of optimizing care for patients, caring for their clinical needs, some of which are unmet and some of which are poorly met, some which are never met, as we continue to optimize patient care, because patients are our most incredible and precious substance upon which we build our careers, our lives, and our worlds. It's been wonderful to have people there. This has just been terrific. Aaron and his staff have been a great contributor. We have learned a lot. It's wonderful to have you all here. We need to remember that there will be a couple of pieces going forward to allow us to broaden this sharing, broaden this learning. MDIC in 2021 and June 1st and 2nd as their annual public forum. And that is an incredibly interesting one to go to. There are patients there, there are companies there, there are physicians there, there are institutions there, there are the regulatory people there. And then the 3D in 2021, September 23 and 24, again, later this year. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate your answers to the polling questions, which were pretty neat. We appreciate your participation on this journey that started with a prodome, went through FDA, and continues on with the journey with all of us in this field of early feasibility studies. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you for being here, wherever you are, with all of us.